objective to make as much progress as we can between now and then. When we last met, we discussed many things, but of the things we discussed were, before moving on, the minutes should normally be here for us to review. The House of Parliament, though, because they're taking very detailed minutes, almost contribution by contribution, in order to prepare the report from the Joint Select Committee, the minutes are not, from last week, aren't available, and accept the apologies, and we'll work with you. Right? And understanding being, if there's any egregious things that need to be corrected at a later stage, we won't shy away from doing so. Among the things that we discussed were having a transitional arrangement in the bill to account for the obvious fact that everything won't be ready at the same time. If the bill were to become effective now, you wouldn't have the board in place, you wouldn't have and the bank may have to act for a certain time under the old arrangements before the new arrangements come into place. So the BOJ needs to give some thought to that. We discussed the matter of the authorized capital and having unlimited authorized capital as is permitted by the Companies Act, and I don't think there was any hesitation to move in that direction, but I believe Member Golden had asked for an accounting memo where the precise definitions of the items that make up capital we could see, and therefore it could be captured accurately in the drafting, and I believe that's forthcoming, not for today but at a later stage.
And there was his point about the 5%.
Yeah, I'm getting to that, yeah. And then there's also the point about whether or not there should be any distributions below 5% of capital. And I must tell you that that's something I'm not opposed to at all, that distributions would only occur when the capital is at 5% or above. What it means, it holds the prospect of lessening the amount of transactions between GOJ and BOJ, and we really don't want to get down to 3. Coming back to the Parliament for new capital, we want that to be once in 20 years, once a decade, something like that. So, if there's a period that the bank is going through where capital has been eroded by losses, then there should be no need for distribution until you're at a point that you're above 5%. I'm open to that, and we can, unless there are any strenuous objections. The last time we were at clause 14, and I remember Senator Brown had asked to sort of delay until the next meeting, as Member Bunting had left, and we did that. I think that we need to proceed, and always open to hearing any views that Member Bunting may have on this clause, even though I think this clause is in support of the position that he had advanced. So section 14, which is on page 12 of the bill, reads, Section 23 of the Principal Act is amended by deleting the proviso to paragraph F and substituting therefore the following: provided that the maximum loan or advance granted against any such security as is mentioned in subparagraph 3 or 4 shall be based on the bank's determination of the risk of such security losing its value during the life of the loan, and deleting paragraph J. And what this is really, in the current act, the amount that the central bank can advance against securities offered is artificially restricted at 75% of the value. And that's not consistent with the regime that we're trying to bring in place, where we're going to see the bank using open market operations actively. And there will be instances where the bank may wish to, on its own discretion as to the risk of the underlying security, advance more than 75%, advance 90%, advance 95%, as the case may be. And including this would allow the bank to do so. And removing J is just to allow the scheme to be consistent. So if there are no, you have a comment on it?
Yes, Chair. There was also a suggestion, I think, from a member that that phrase, losing its value, might be improved to make clear that it's the realizable or fair value. I seem to recall, and we hadn't settled on that. I don't think we have any objection. It is what is intended. It's meant to be the realizable value, I think, perhaps. Fair value. George? Fair value would be fine.
Fair, yeah, happy with that.
Suggested to insert fair
before value.
Before value.
Yes.
Minister, sorry. There was also the consequential amendment that had been mentioned in relation to 24.1c, which makes reference to 23J, and that point had been made for that deletion to be made at 24.1c.
In addition.
In addition.
Yes, sure. Okay. All right. The next section introduces a new part. The Monetary Policy Committee, and that section 34 of the BOJ bill has been absolutely slaughtered so many times that the new numbering is 34FA, which means there's a 34A, B, C, D, and D, E, D, F, and now we're at FA. Wow. So in this section, the Monetary Policy Committee of the bank is being laid out and being defined, and this is a step towards diffusing the decision making of the central bank. There's no such section in the existing BOJ Act, and by legislation we would be imposing that the bank has a Monetary Policy Committee that's made up in a particular way, and it describes how they're appointed, who would be ineligible, and how the decisions and minutes of that meeting will be transmitted.
So, Minister, so the bill proposes the introduction of Part 5AA to deal with the MPC, and it covers clauses 34FA to 34FG for the Monetary Policy Committee, and Part 5AB for the Financial Policy Committee. Minister, Clause 34FA in Part 5AA deals with the definitions applicable to this section, and it defines the committee as referring to the Monetary Policy Committee. It provides definition for government company and medium term are defined. Of note, medium term is defined to mean a period not less than 36 months. And this will be relevant to the reference made later in the bill to the inflation target. But Minister, of note, where the definition of government company is concerned, this is used in the bill with respect to exclusions from eligibility for appointment to the MPC and the FPC, and we'll refer to sections 34FB6D and 34FI6D at pages 14 and 20. There's also reference, Chairman, to government company at clause 24B of the bill, which provides that the schedule of the Principal Act be amended with the insertion of a new paragraph 2D to include among the persons who may not be appointed or remain as a director. And among those are persons employed in a government company. So given that this definition appears in at least 3 sections of the bill, we are suggesting that it could be removed from this section, this definition, and be included in a general section.
Because it applies more broadly.
It applies more broadly.
Okay, so we would move that up. Okay, if there are no sort of comments on the definitions, 34FB1 just establishes that there will be a monetary policy committee that have responsibility for formulating monetary policy. And there were no comments on that in the brief that we received. Section 2 speaks to the composition, 3 ex officio members and 2 members pursuant to subsection 4. And then subsection 3 says who the ex officio members are. And up until that point, we don't have any comments.
Question.
Yes.
Whilst we have the composition of the committee, but is there a time frame to which this committee is to serve?
Yes, I think later on it speaks to the term of appointment of the committee.
7 on page 14 at the bottom.
As usual, Senator Gale, you're way ahead of the rest of us. The comment I'd have on subsection 3C is, I believe that the ex officio members are the governor, the senior executive who has responsibility for monetary policy, and a senior executive of the bank appointed by the board on the recommendation of the governor. Given that the governor chairs the board and the governor is the CEO of the bank, I don't think it's necessary or maybe not even advisable for the senior executive who is appointed to the monetary policy committee to be so appointed on the recommendation of the governor. It should just be the board of the bank, the senior executive of the bank appointed by the board. So I don't want to suggest that we take out on the recommendation of the governor in subsection C. Right? So it will be the governor, a senior executive responsible for monetary policy, and then another senior executive appointed by the board. So the board plays an important role in, and it just ends full stop there. And we're moving to a regime of diffusing the power, right? And that is why the board becomes so important. Yeah, and we could take this out for the other committees as well. It's not necessary to have the recommendation of the governor. Subsection 4, on the bottom of page 13. Yeah.
What I'm trying to find out, my apology for absence, for lateness. I'm sure my friend did the duty. But is there a definition of senior executive? Could that be a deputy governor or a rank other than that?
It's not defined in the statute, but the term is intended to cover the eventuality of it. It could be a deputy governor, it could be a division chief. It would depend on who is the senior executive responsible for monetary policy, so that individual would sit at B, yes.
That's B, but that's
yes.
C.
At C now, it would be
another senior executive.
Yes, and that would be for the board to determine in this case. What you would expect is it would be a very senior executive, but it would depend on the in order to have a little flexibility, if you define it as a position or a rank, then it may constrain the relevant person that would best suit the role without a benefit of any kind. So.
Okay, so subsection 4 deals with the method of appointment, and it says, subsection 4, subject to the provisions of this part, the Governor General in Council shall appoint 2 persons to be members of the committee, hereinafter referred to in this part as appointed members. I believe
Chairman, Chairman, the Jamaica Cooperative Credit Union League and the private sector organization in their submission commented that the appointment by the GG in Council is still likely to be subject to political influence. And they also observe that under the fit and proper definition, there are matters which are determined by the minister acting on the advice of the governor. They therefore recommend that the appointment of MPC members be done by the GG acting on the advice of special commission established for that purpose. We would suggest, Minister, or note that these appointments are not meant to be removed exclusive from political influence. as someone has to be responsible to the people, even for an independent central bank.
Yeah, and this is, something that the previous amendments to the Bank of Jamaica Act in 2014 and 2015 sort of confronted, and I remember those debates at the time, and I remember the explanations that were offered. And I've also had conversations with persons involved in decision making at that time, and settled then on Governor General and Council as the best for our purposes in Jamaica. And that was a method that was settled on for the appointment of the governor. And here it's just been extended to members of the Monetary Policy Committee, putting them at the same sort of level, so to speak, or the same the prestige of the appointment is similar. So, the idea of having a separate committee, while we understand the rationale, for this, I just don't think that's would be appropriate. No, we were saying that the members of the Monetary Policy Committee, the appointed members, would have to satisfy the fit and proper criteria under Section 2A and have relevant experience, qualifications, or qualification or experience in economics, banking, finance, commerce, accounting, business, or law. We haven't left anything out there. Statistics, or
economics would cover.
Economics.
No, about a catch-all or other relevant discipline or profession.
Have the relevant experience.
I think the intention is that these are the areas you want to be really looking at: economics, banking, finance, commerce, accounting, business, or law.
For the Monetary Policy Committee, Senator Brown, I guess we would definitely. This is one area that we definitely want to be specific.
Yeah, it's not generalist. It's not a general understanding of something. It's not just a bright person who happens to have been, be interested. You want to be sure that you have that, but also some background, something to offer, something that helps them to be able to respond and be able to influence the technical decision making and other of the bank. The point is to have people who are able to influence what's going on there, and this is a very is a type of discussion that is highly informed by economics, typically, but not exclusively economics. We think that it's broadened so that you're not locked into having some specific qualification, but it's expected that a minister will be typically looking for, advanced, experienced economists, not exclusively, but hopefully, that can then go toe-to-toe inside that room with the arrayed staff of the bank who will have all of those advantages. I think the idea is also to have business experience, maybe an understanding of somebody who might have had a lot of experience in the budget cycle, for example. A governmental person might have a good experience, but without being an economist, who are able to shed some light. So there are a variety of angles. We don't want to limit it too much. I think that would be maybe a little dangerous, but it's meant to locate the focus on matters that are relevant to an MPC.
Yeah, okay. And then we have that they can't fall in the grounds. They can't fall within any of the grounds for revocation in subsection 9. I think there was a comment on the next subsection from Member Golding. In 6, it says the following persons shall not be eligible: members of the board of the bank. And that if you say members of the board of the bank, does that definition not capture the executive members of the board?
So if I could, Minister, we would propose that A be amended to read appointed members of the board, and we are also proposing that or statutory committees be added, bearing in mind a comment made at I think a previous meeting where you want to be clear that somebody on the FPC wouldn't sit on the MPC. And therefore, to take care of your point, Chairman, it would read, and the other point, appointed members of the board or statutory committees. And Minister, that would also mean that there would be a definition included at clause 2, which of statutory committees, that would make it clear that this is speaking of the FPC, the Financial Policy Committee, the Financial System Stability Committee, the FRC, the Financial Regulatory Committee, Supervisory Committee. So we would propose wording that would cover that as well.
What I'm suggesting is that if a member is on this committee, they can't sit on any other of the named committees.
Appointed members.
Appointed,
so
right.
yes, so the executives wouldn't be included in that provision. It would be appointed members. Chair, there were also 3 points, I think, that were raised by Member Golding on this particular clause, which I made a note of and which we're commenting on. One was that he suggested that there be a 3-year cooling off period for all of the persons who are ineligible that are mentioned there. We, however, the cooling off period, I should mention, that he's referring to would mean that if someone should be in any of these positions and they should leave those positions, and for a period of 3 years, they still would be ineligible from being able to sit on the committee. So that's the cooling off period. So after you're no longer a member of the board or a member of the House or Senate, there would be 3 years that you would still be ineligible. So that was the member's point. And it's noted, however, a concern may be whether this may be considered to be too stringent, especially given the added limitation that might result in an ability to find unconflicted members. And so that would be our response, Chair and committee members.
And just to add to that point, I don't think that it would be desirable or even I think the intention to prevent a person moving from the MPC, to come off that committee and then become a member of the FPC or any of those other committees, or being put onto the board, or vice versa. So I don't think that was the intent of the suggestion, but that would be a wrinkle to be addressed as well. So in addition, so you can't. It's hard enough. It will be difficult to find qualified persons who you wish to appoint, who also are fit and proper, and who are willing, and who are not conflicted, and who are willing to serve. This is a difficulty already. So we would suggest that those issues of potential, that these be managed by the appointing person, the government, to balance all those issues and make a suitable appointment, rather than put in a cooling off period coming into these positions. It's a different story when someone leaves the committee. We haven't addressed that in this bill, but that kind of garden leave kind of limitation, is something that should be considered. But this is about who you appoint to the committee.
A second point that the member raised was that at clause 6, subclause 6E, where it refers to directors, officers, employees, or external auditors of the financial institution, the member had indicated that it should be extended to any partner or employee of the external auditor of a financial institution. And we think that to be a fair point, and that we would think that could be, in our views, a reasonable one to be supported. It's 3 years. That's a term.
And the next point was on the financial institution, the definition of it?
Yes, and for that one, Chair, financial institution, although not defined in that part, is already defined in the Bank of Jamaica Act as amended.
So just to be sure, on the previous one, that's not one that you're proposed be accepted, just for the Secretary?
Yes, we were saying that it would be, we think, reasonable, because it's speaking to directors, officers, employees, or financial auditors of a financial institution, external audit of a financial institution. And the member is saying that it should also extend to a partner or employee of the external auditor of the financial institution. And so we were...
Sorry, no, these people are not allowed to serve on the Monetary Policy Committee, but we're not doing the 3 years. Okay, that's what to be clear on, because she's making a note.
By saying external auditor, it doesn't actually spell out the partner or employee of the external auditor. That's what's not clear.
Okay, so the partner or employee of the external auditor, but we're not going to 3 year back. Yeah, okay.
On the point to do with the financial institution, member had said that it's not defined and should be, but we're pointing out that financial institution is already defined in the Act by way of the 2014 amendment, and so that is not necessary to be done there. In relation to subclause 7, as we'll see, that is where...
Before I go to 7, Chairman, those ineligible to sit at 6, I've constantly raised the issue of somebody who is a candidate for a parish council or municipality, or candidate, or for the House of Representatives, didn't make it, but is eligible to sit, whereas he or she made it, they wouldn't be eligible. I believe we should include candidates in recent elections, in the most recent election, so that it also applies.
And I think the principle is reasonable, but how do we capture? You're saying if somebody declares as a candidate
in the last 5 years,
who has been selected, well, Governor, what do you?
I think I understand where you may be going with it, but just to be clear that what's embodied here is addressing the conflict, to make sure that officers of the state and others who are in conflict can't sit. I think the issue of whether a person who is in a political sort of or a declared political perspective or competition should be barred, I think perhaps needs more thought as to how you would put that, but it doesn't have the same sort of justification as is embodied here. There's no conflict with your role. It's you may be a very desirable appointee. I mean, I don't want to sort of try to argue it because I think it merits some consideration, but I would say be a little cautious with it. So, for example, a very eligible and qualified person to sit offers themselves as a member, as a candidate, is persuaded to offer themselves as a candidate in an election, and by virtue of that, and they lose, then they now no longer they can't be appointed. I think, or if the member means while you're in the period of electioneering you're prohibited, that would be a very short period, and maybe it could be handled in another way.
I'm going beyond the electioneering period. I'm focused. In other words, these people are political people. Essentially, whatever way you call them, it's not a conflict with the state, because the opposition person could very well be not in part of the state in that sense, in the narrowest sense of it. What we're trying to exclude, as I understand it, is the politicization of this position. And I've seen too often in this country, on both sides of the divide, political candidates have been lost, are then trusted into high position, and can carry out the same political impact. So for me, those people should also be included in this list. And it's not out of state. If you contested an election in the last 5 years in the municipality or in the House of Representatives, you should not be eligible. And you could also, somebody resigns as a senator or no longer a senator, we put a period that limit their participation in a matter like this.
So, Chair, if I may, as I said, that's tackling the politics of political. I think that's an issue that can be addressed. I don't want to be commenting on that directly, but I want to just emphasize that it's not about the political. It's not about just politics. It's about, these are people who are they're directing government, they're in office, and so it's making sure that the bank's leadership is not conflicted with government as you define it. I mean, I understand the point.
Do we lose anything by having that prohibition?
I think so. I think
what do we lose?
Well, I think we're going to find that there are excellent candidates to participate in board and so on who would be nominated, who now have to choose whether they're going to be involved in politics openly or not, and because they will then be excluded. And it seems to me that you'd want to consider a bit more the sort of talent pool of people you're talking about. I mean, again, it's something to consider. I would say take a bit more care to contemplate what the implications are than I'm just reacting off the cuff to the idea. But that's what I would be concerned about. In a sense, once this is interpreted as a way of keeping politics out of the bank in the sense of political people, then I understand the point. But this is not what these clauses are for, because we want to be quite clear. I think the leaders of the institution who are appointed from outside, there's not anything wrong with a person who's been political being put into that position, if that's what somebody wants to appoint. Okay, and indeed we have to recognize that the question is whether there are people who have been declared to be political, because there are many people involved in politics who are never declared to be political but are highly political who are also appointed, and people know this as well. So I'm making the point that the depoliticizing of the bank is about the structures of governance that you mentioned and the balance and the diffusion of power so that the bank can do its job under appropriate oversight from independent or external folks who are appointed by the political directorate. It's not for those people who are appointed to somehow not have any political persuasion or active view. In fact, it may be the opposite. It may be that it's necessary for a government at a time and a parliament who feel that the bank is going this way.
You're using the word political. There's political and there's partisan.
Partisan political. Yeah,
right. So
yeah.
I would agree with you in terms of political, in terms of people's philosophy. There's nothing wrong in having an outlook, right. And everybody has an outlook, right. Whether you know it or not. Yeah. But there's a difference between that and partisan. Yeah.
And I think I'm making the point that it is. I'd like to just go as far as saying it's in the scheme being put together here. It's not to be seen as a wrong thing for a government that has a view about how policy should be implemented, because as our economist friends here will know, the church of economics as to what to do and how to do it and what to prioritize is very broad. Lots of controversy. So there's room for difference, and those differences are often reflected in a political space, a political perspective. Okay, so as that is chosen and the government of the day makes their choices, the idea is to we should try not to constrain that unless it would harm the bank, so that influence on the institution is able to be inserted by properly qualified people, including on the MPC, who are appointed with whatever views they may have. So that's not wrong. That's actually what we're trying to insert into the bank in a suitable way, where the bank itself has the majority on the committee, has a board appointed with a staggered process, so that we have the ability to influence by the outside in a visible way that can be, seen, and not some sort of behind-the-scenes kind of influence. So I just want to make that point about politics.
The person can't dominate. How strongly you feel, Senator Brown?
I can see where Senator Brown might be focusing, but you can have persons who are appointed on this specific committee that are politically inclined, because it's a philosophy. And you can't really identify a philosophy until somebody starts preaching it. But what I believe this particular area is suggesting is that once you're appointed, there ought to be no conflict of interest with the operations of the bank and the state itself. And that's why it's so defined. It's more on protecting conflict of interest than anything else.
In the case of B and C, right? And remember, the others are some others. Yes, exactly. There are different conflicts being managed here. So just if I can be clear, I think the idea deserves exploration. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, and we could, but I would say it's a different motivation, the politics, and should be considered, in the context of my answer, I think. and then...
I may have seen it in another legislation. I'm trying to recall several others. But if we come up again, on it again, Chair, we can examine it.
Chair, sorry, there was one other thought. Just to be clear, the person who is actually electioneering, I think that point I see in the middle of an election, should you be sitting on the board? That deserves...
I mean, so many things are left up to judgment, and we just...
Yeah.
And, you know, and in government, you can have people making decisions of good judgment and decisions of questionable judgment. Somebody appointing somebody who's an active... I don't think there's been any precedent for that at all in anything to do with the BOJ since independence. That I'm aware of. Let's put it that way. You want Senator Brown?
Yeah, I put my position on this. It's a small country. The bank asking us to give them a lot of latitude, a lot of independence. It then says, well, you know, leave out the members of parliament, senators or hosts, leave out the parish councillor who have some ideas, maybe a great economist too, maybe devoid of politics, maybe a neutral. You know, is not representing any other political party, an independent, they call him. But you said, leave that person out. But the parish council has no fiscal responsibility over the parish council have no, the municipal authority have no direct link. So if you leave that person out, why is it okay that the candidate who ran against that person and lost, only by virtue of being lost, but it's tied into the politics, whether on Covan's side or my side, should be allowed to sit there? Because, and that's my concern, it strikes me that we're discriminating against winners, and we want to promote the losers. I've seen many losers being promoted into position which will cause us further loss. So I've put my position. It's subject to the rest of us.
Here's a prime example.
We don't want the losers. We appreciate that.
Chairman, here's a prime example. So Senator Horton is a senator, and he's going to be a candidate also that may very well lose, but he's an economist. So you're going to exempt him.
But if when you keep him can't go on.
Yeah, but if he wins,
first he has to give up the senatorship.
Yeah.
If he's going to run at the appropriate point. So my concern is we are excluding people because they ran and won, but we are open to people who ran and lost, because somehow in this country there's no connection to the state.
Just frame it.
I refuse to believe that.
No, frame it.
I've seen people being appointed where they didn't run, but they are appointed to all different positions.
Well, framing it differently. You know, Senator Brown, Senator Horton is running and he's a member of a board, but framing it differently. It is not people who are excluded. It is offices that are excluded. So it's not winners or losers excluded, but offices. And we're just saying that these offices those offices, regardless of who holds them, they have a permanent conflict with being on the NPC.
In the union movement, we describe it as post versus personal. But oftentimes they're one and the same. I hear you. I don't accept your position, but I put mine, and I'm prepared to move on.
Thank you, Senator.
I'll argue it again elsewhere.
Thank you again, Senator.
Is that with the understanding that we don't want to have losers appointed? Just can we make that principle clear? Yes. No, we were just.
Let's move on. No. Senator's offered to move on. Let's take him on it.
Yes.
And let's get to subsection 7. I think Senator Gale, you had asked about the term. Here, the term is being specified as 5 years.
Yes.
For the appointment. So we'll have turnover, and the scheme is such that this is shorter than the term that's being proposed for the board members over time. Okay? And subsection 8, that appointed members shall be eligible for reappointment in a, one of the things that I have already found in a country like Jamaica, as long as we continue to have or train people leave at the rates that they do, finding suitable people for these positions is incredibly difficult. So I think subsection 8 is absolutely necessary. And then subsection 9 deals with the revocation. Were there any? I don't think we got any comments on those. The revocation of appointment, if the person fails to satisfy the fit and proper requirements, becomes of unsound mind, or becomes permanently unable to perform functions, fails to carry out the functions required of a member of the committee, or engages in activities that can reasonably consider to be incompatible with his continued membership of the committee.
Just for clarification, because in Senator Brown and myself world, when someone fails to carry out, it might be a performance issue that is visible. In this case, how do you define or how do you clarify or quantify a failure to carry out?
Governor?
Could I just offer that it could include not showing up for meetings, not carrying out actions that might be required arising from committee meetings. So that could be some of those that are mentioned, referred to. And I think it's good to have it wide enough to capture situations that one can't define now, but would be clear as not being consistent with what is required by you as a committee member.
If I feel as a board member or committee member that C has been, I'm not guilty of C, who do I appeal to? No appeal exists for that? What if I am of the view, rightly or wrongly, that maybe the minister stepped in and spoke to some people and I am removed for that? Maybe I didn't vote for something. Is there grounds to appeal? Is there a committee that decides whether I fail? How does the Governor General and Council get to the point? Do I get even a bite of the cherry to respond? Is there a natural justice issue here?
No.
There should be some mechanism where this person can say, because the spirit is to keep the people there. So to challenge such a revocation.
If I may say,
it's even to the internal Privy Council, because the GG is acting in council, it's really cabinet. If it's even to the GG Privy Council.
I think part of this question, Minister, will involve the question.
It does appear a little broad and arbitrary.
Well, yes, except it is the Governor General in Council, so that will require not just Cabinet, but the Governor General going along with it. And you would not expect a person who's wrongly dismissed to be silent about it. Okay, so, but at the same time, and I appreciate where the question is coming from, or the concern. On the other hand, it's very important that where such a thing has been decided, that there is somebody else in the job immediately. So we don't want an extensive process. I think you'd want to establish not appeal so much as reasons and stuff like that, so that people can see what you chose to do. That's what I would suggest. I mean, and if greater safeguards are required to protect, a person than the terms here, which would include, I presume, court as well. People would be able to challenge such an action as well, and perhaps that's what would happen. I mean, a configuration, just to put this into sort of, it's not, I don't think it's a, what's the word? It's not an impossible situation that the senator's describing, where somebody is removed. For example, somebody was appointed under a previous administration, new administration has come in, they come up with a reason to say, well, let's remove him, short of the he has 3 more years to go. Let's just remove this inconvenience and put somebody else in. There would be situations, I would imagine, where that could occur. It should not, because they would need to have reasons and present the reasons to the Governor General and be able to carry through the revocation. What might strengthen this might be demonstrating or requiring reasons to be given, perhaps. Chair, I don't know.
Can you expand on that?
How I look at it, because you have a set of rules that should appear homogeneous in nature. A, B, and D are specific. You can quantify them. The only identifiable factor that has been suggested for C is if you don't come to meetings. The others that might be suggested are subjective. And so somebody who don't like a member, or if a minister want to change a member, or if the governor of the day cannot get along with that member, they can suggest that they are failing to carry out without being able to quantify. It's wide.
Yeah, but you would agree, though, that for a position of this prestige and importance, not being able to remove a member for performance is not acceptable either.
I agree with that. But you see, you can identify non-performance, and you can point out the non-performance. But this just says fails to carry out functions.
Chair, would it assist if we were to consider inserting somewhere in this, in a removal, the board? The board. If we were to insert in the process the board, so that when this revocation is happening, there's another body, the board, that would have to either recommend, concur, agree, or comment.
Yeah.
I would agree with. That I would agree to consider.
That sounds like a comfort that can work.
The board has responsibility to oversee the overall running of all of this.
Right.
So there would be some complaint or problem that the board would. So the board would review. Well, yeah. So perhaps it would be may at any time. On consultation or after consultation with the board, perhaps, so that the board is required to be involved, and therefore the position of the board in any action, if there's controversy, would then be able to be
which would public.
Establish a process. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah.
It can't be because you didn't like the last monetary policy decision.
It's only if everybody didn't like it, including the board.
Yes, Minister. Chairman, some of us do recall a public service commission being dumped, so that we are aware of some practical reality and consequences that could flow from innocent decisions that we're making. And that is why we're trying to preserve.
Point well made. Point well made. So include the board in it. That the board has to
be consulted.
Yes,
before.
It can't be without them.
Yeah.
Governor General in Council consults with the board? Because it presupposes
the wording is going to be worked on, but the idea would.
Because what I'm seeing in subclause 9 is that the Governor General in Council has the power, and we can move to the point where we are certain that the Governor General in Council will act judiciously. So he wouldn't be doing any of these things that are set out in ABC without taking into consideration.
Yes, but it just puts on, because the point being made is that A, B, and D are very precise, well-defined, very objective. There's a subjective element to C. So there's an additional layer of protection is having another body. It's what is like a double.
But we say B becomes of unsound mind. That has to be.
That's more objective.
B would require medical.
It has to be determined by a medical.
Yeah, B would have medical.
Yes.
This is in most statutes.
Yes. C is a little more general, and so it's having a second confirmation, essentially having a board. I think is a reasonable inclusion.
I just wanted to make the point that we have to be cognizant that we have other committees that we've established by amendments, for instance, a Financial System Stability Committee. And in these provisions here, it's the minister who has the power to revoke, and the same function, the same provisions with respect to how you may revoke the appointment. They're similar to what we have here now. Are we then going to be amending these provisions in relation to these committees to bring them on par with what we're doing now?
So if we, I think
but I
Chair,
understand the concern.
I think Chair and
Chair, sorry I'm late. I just think some consistency on these sort of issues across the committees is. Yeah, sorry. I'm saying, sorry I'm late. Some consistency, not some, consistency around these types of issues in relation to the committees, this sort of standing committees within the bank, would be a good thing to achieve. And I don't think it's a big deal if the decision is that for removal under C, that requires you to act on the recommendation of the board. Whoever has the revocatory power should act on the recommendation of the board in relation to C. It's quite easy to apply that to each of the three committees. It's not a major thing.
I agree.
Yeah.
So the answer is yes. If we're going to change C, let's change it to the other committees.
Minister, that's in terms of the consultation part.
Yes, the board.
Because they do have different appointing. That's not what we're changing here.
We're not changing that. No.
Right.
No, we're changing. This section deals with revocation.
Yeah.
So we're changing, making the revocation.
The consultation with the board.
Yes. And
even if it's the minister revoking in one case.
Yes, even absolutely. Because what we're doing is that's the whole purpose behind strengthening the board, staggering the appointments, and giving them tenure. Right?
In terms of D now, engages in activities that can be reasonably considered to be incompatible. Are we treating incompatibility as the same as conflict of interest in this case? Because suppose...
That's one example of it.
Yeah, that's one example.
Rather than conflict of interest.
Yeah.
Rather than conflict of interest.
Okay, yeah. All right. Yeah.
All right, so if we can move to 10, just says that we have to publish in the Gazette. And 11, it's assigned a secretary. I don't think there were any comments on those. And
it's on 11, because I'm going to be told this is how we do it all the time. When last, I shouldn't ask you that, but I probably should ask my senator colleague, when last you see a Gazette, Andre? So maybe we should put it in other publications that are also. There was a time when the Gazette was it in terms of legislation, but there may be other things. Huh?
That's bigger than this legislation specifically, though, I think.
I know, that's what I'm saying, but this copying that it shall be published in the Gazette, nobody going to see it. How much can copy publish? Just as a formality. What we really want to do is to convey it to the nation. The Gazette is no longer only the rich people.
You need a bigger fix.
I don't think the purpose of gazetting it is to make everybody aware. That can't be the purpose, because as you've said, very few people, some people don't even know what the Gazette is. Very few people read the Gazette. But it's more establishing the fact that it has happened, and that you can show that it has happened, that it has been formally done.
It's a place of record.
It's a place of record.
Yeah.
If you think it ought to be.
And the question I ask, is the Gazette the only place of record in today?
I think no, but Senator Brown, seriously, I think that is it's a reasonable sort of point, but it's bigger than this bill, and
So I'm raising it here because this is not the last time I'm going to raise it.
No, I agree.
I have to start somewhere, and I'm just thinking that the Gazette is
it could be some Bitcoin-related thing in the future. I mean, the thing of record.
Pull it up for this, but I'm making a point for the record that this old-time thing of the Gazette being the only organ of record in a time of social media, in a time of even the traditional media of the 17th century. Well, maybe 18. Huh?
Why don't we ask, let me ask the Solicitor General, the Solicitor General who will be able to opine on this.
So there was a time when we used to talk about when you gazette something, it's noticed to the world. But we know better. It's not really noticed to the world. But there is an act, the Jamaica Gazette Act. And what it means is that when you gazette something, judicial notice can be taken of it. So you can present it as evidence in court. So it does serve a useful purpose. But what we have done from time to time in more modern legislation is to add other means of publication. So there are times when we have talked as well as, in addition to, where we don't own, sometimes we used to talk about publishing in a newspaper in daily publication, and we have now gone beyond that in some tax laws to even talk about publishing on a website.
My concern is not
we have examples in this.
It's not to remove the Gazette, It's too simple to say we must go beyond the Gazette and we must lead. But,
The idea is to really inform the public of the appointments. Then you could add, and in a daily newspaper of general circulation in Jamaica, and on that you could also say on the website of the BOJ, you could say all of those things. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, those things customarily happen, but you want to legislate it? You want to?
We're making legislation now. So if we see it, let's move forward. Let's move into the modern era. I don't want to be criticized and say we're backward and we're into Gazette and this. I want to take the approach that the Sol General said exists. But it's not a deal breaker for me. I'm just saying because as parliamentarians, we need to move from, what is the year of the Gazette Act again? 18 how much? Or is it 17 somewhere? So that's what I want to move beyond.
But if I could say, Chairman, if it wasn't an old act, we'd actually write one. We'd do a new one. Because in the age of multiple media, social media, all the different ways, if you're trying to reach people, then spread it out. But if you want to be sure that there's a record that you can rely on, that this is what happened, and all different parties can go there and there's no dispute, you need a record. In the States, it's a congressional record. In every country, you have to have something. We call it the Gazette. But it's essential to have this place of record, and that's what this is about. The wider publication others have spoken about, and this act has many cases, or a number of cases, where it's proposed that things are made more public. But also, if you don't gazette it, then there's a potential legal consequence here to the appointment.
Don't want to drag it out, but I'm not saying don't gazette it. I'm simply saying this. We must move beyond the Gazette. Keep the Gazette, but move beyond it and publish it elsewhere. Other people want to know, other than the few rich people and the lawyers who read the Gazette. Well, other than the few lawyers and the fewer rich people who get the Gazette.
I'm a firm believer that Senator Brown, we use the law sparingly. We use the law. Or we bring legislation where we're trying to incentivize behavior in a particular way. If it were the case that these were not ordinarily being published in newspapers and ordinarily being published on websites, then I think it would be a case to use the law. But my recollection is that every time there are boards of the BOJ, you read about it in the paper, and so on. I mean, these things generally are circulated. So I take the point, but I don't think the condition in society warrants the use of the law to compel it, because it's already happening.
I hear you. I'm not fighting it. I just checked the Gazette Act was operational on the 18th of May, 1906. Amended in 1969.
Well, that's before the earthquake.
Sorry? So all I'm saying that, that was...
I must say, I don't even know who the directors of the BOJ are right now.
But it was in a newspaper, though,
Maybe.
when they were appointed.
I don't know. I'm not sure, because it's not required to be published there, so I don't know. Yeah.
Tabled in this house.
Huh? Yes, I should know.
All right. So on 12, we sort of got into 12 before the question. We're saying they should not meet less than 8 times a year, and such meetings shall be held at such place and at such times, and on such days as the committee may determine, and such dates and times shall be published in such manner as shall be prescribed. Because the idea is that the meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee is something that the public should be aware of, and the regulations will specify how many we should know. The public should know X days in advance that an MPC meeting is going to be held. All right, and we didn't have any sort of comments on that aspect. And then the next just talks about the conduct of the meeting. The chairman shall preside, and in the absence of the chairman, they elect a member. The committee shall be responsible for keeping minutes, and subject to the provision of the Act, the committee may regulate its own proceedings. There's no need to specify a quorum in the Act. That's because you regulate your own proceedings, right?
Yes, and in fact, someone had made that point that there should be a quorum, but none of the other committees, as I recall it, have a provision for quorum, and that is dealt with under the administration of own proceedings provision. So the FSSC, as I recall, and the other committees do not specify the actual quorum in the statute itself.
Right, okay, fair enough. So if we could move to...
As the quorum is not a moving target, it has to be established at hopefully a first meeting, as we have done for this committee and others. So, and then should be published. Maybe in the Gazette, but at least somebody would know.
Well, the minutes of the meeting are going to be published, so... So, if we could, on 34C, a member of the committee and persons working on behalf of the committee shall not disclose non-public information regarding the operations of the committee or the performance of his functions under this part, save and except as may be authorized by the committee or the chairman.
Chairman, Member Golding had raised in the comments that he had put forward, he made the comment that no sanction for breach of the secrecy obligation was noted for Section 34 FC. We had pointed out that and he proposed that there should be sanctions as in 34 FK2, which is on page 23, relating to the FPC. And we would point out that the secrecy provisions provided for at 34 FK2 relate to breaches of the FPC members who have information in relation to licensees. And under this provision, the FPC members who breach secrecy may be liable to fines, unspecified imprisonment, not exceeding 3 years. And this is identical to the provisions relating to the supervisory committee members under the BSA. So it is not our recommendation that this be included here for the MPC members. We would mention that should it be that there is any such breach, then this would certainly qualify for grounds for revocation of the appointment under Section 34 FB9. So that would be our comments in relation to that.
If we could just add to that, Chair. The MPC does have to act with confidentiality, but it's not, we want to be careful that if you put this penalty of imprisonment, etc., it does ramp up the secrecy, and it would causes persons to become reticent if they're serious about this, which they would be. And therefore, a member of a monetary policy committee who we will want them to be able to speak publicly, not to share secrets, but to talk about policy, talk about issues, there's a risk that we end up sort of curbing too much the ability to have dialogue, but we want them to respect the secrecy of the committee. So we propose it's a different environment, a different type of confidentiality from those who are involved in the supervision, essentially, of deposit-taking institutions, where there's extra detailed information or information about individuals who aren't even themselves licensed. It's the customers of those licensees as well. that may leak into the FPC, which is why we decided to put that provision there. Even though the FPC is dealing with rules and policies, in order to do that properly, they may have to have information, and so they need to be brought under that tent. So that was the reason for the distinction, and the rest of the bank operates under secrecy arrangements that you might want to mention.
Chairman, just on the secrecy issue, sorry, you want to,
So I was going to mention that under this construct of the Act, the Section 47.3 provides for officers and servants of the bank and external auditors who breach secrecy on matters to do with the affairs of the bank. They could be subject to conviction before RM court and fines and imprisonment. So that's officers, servants of the bank, external auditors. The officers and servants of the bank who may breach provisions of secrecy as regards licensees under 47.1. No, it's 47.1, sorry. It's 47.1. Under that provision also there is provision for conviction, etc. We would mention that under 34D, a breach by authorized officers who are in the supervisory department and the deputy supervisor and the supervisor also would be subject to that level of sanctions. In relation to directors of the bank, there is a provision in our bylaws, the one that's here from 1960, that speaks to this, and it states that every director shall, on appointment or reappointment, sign a declaration as in the form of the schedule affirming allegiance and service and pledging strict secrecy. Sorry?
There are no cases of breach of the record.
And there are no cases of any breach that we have noted. So therefore we have the provision relating to directors, we have provisions relating to staff in general and the auditors, and we have provisions relating to the functions which deal with matters to do with the licensees, which are elevated to the position that we have mentioned in terms of sanctions.
Sure, I get the impression that a collective decision can be made to reveal some things. Under the current construct, a collective decision of the bank board can be made. The cabinet, for example, have strict secrecy laws, but it says without the permission of the cabinet, the disclosure can't take place, shouldn't take place without the permission of the cabinet.
This does say unless authorized by the committee or its chairman.
All right, this covers that. Cool.
But
I wish to ask.
Sorry, I wanted to respond because their thing was a response to a point I had made. First of all, I don't like having a provision with a prohibition in a statute, but with no consequence attached to breaching it. Because the question arises, what is the effect of breaching it? And in fact, it's not clearly a ground even for revoking the appointment of a member, because unless you're going to say it falls under D, and the question arises whether or not the D was intended to cover something like that, given that there's a specific provision dealing with this, which doesn't mention any sanction. I'm not saying the sanction that is applied to the other committee, the Financial Policy Committee, is necessarily the right sanction, though it seemed to me that given that that committee is itself tasked with certain specific, or not so specific, but certain functions, and if they disclose confidential information, they are liable to a penalty. I really didn't understand why this other committee wasn't established on the same basis. I mean, I understand Senator Brown's point, but as has been pointed out, there is provision for public disclosure by consensus. What shouldn't happen is a rogue member, so to speak, goes to and blurts out some very sensitive thing about what was before the committee, and there's no sanction for that.
Suppose we added in the grounds for dismissal, breach of the secrecy provisions of the Monetary Policy Committee.
Yeah, I mean,
as outlined in 34.
A breach of Section 34C could be an explicit ground in 9, subsection 9 of the previous section. That's one way of approaching it. In a sense, it's kind of it's a weak sanction, but it's yeah. But I mean, if that's what you think is appropriate, I'm not convinced that there's a better solution than that. Since it is felt by the bank that there is some very material difference between the members of the Financial Policy Committee breaching the prohibition of secrecy and the members of the Monetary Policy Committee doing so. I must say I'm not persuaded by that distinction. I've heard it, but my bottom line is that there ought to be a clear sanction for this. Yeah.
So let us add that, I think we'd add it here or in 9. We add it in 9 that breach of 34C is grounds for dismissal.
With that, could I ask for recommittal at 17 on page 16? It seems to have
sure.
more quickly.
Yeah.
Again, the issue of the bank determining the fees or salary or honorarium without regard for the Ministry of Finance or the ministry with responsibility for the public service. It's a standard thing we did, and I think we addressed it last week with some of the clauses. So I'm urging that we find words that reflect that at 17, because it would be inconsistent with the other compensation provisions.
Right. Fair enough, Governor.
I think that
the
would
same
be
way we did
consistent.
it
Yes,
for the
I
others.
think we had indicated for those top jobs that it was minister consultation
Yeah, so
with the
we
board.
can just do the same thing here.
Yeah, this could be the same. Yeah.
Chairman, may I just ask in relation to subclause 6 on page 14? I had suggested for consideration of the committee some cooling off period in terms of non-eligibility, that these positions which render someone not eligible, if that person has recently held that position but is not at the time of the appointment.
Yeah, we considered it,
okay.
and the BOJ at the time gave a sort of a response.
Okay.
That the real purpose is to exclude office holders, because it's the office that is in conflict. It's the fact that these persons are on the fiscal side and so forth. And it's not so much that the person held the office, but the office itself. That is a problem. There's nothing that being a member of a Senate sort of precludes you from, if you were serving on the bank. It's just that when you're in the Senate, the office is in conflict.
I would accept that in relation to Senate appointments, but I'm thinking primarily of persons who are insiders at financial institutions and who move from that right into a MPC position, or, you know, the optics of it are not good, and I think that is as important as as anything else. You know, that you don't want to give the appearance that somebody who is closely associated with a particular institution is shifted over and may well still have strong connections. It's kind of why, for example, former auditors are not allowed to serve on the boards of companies that they used to audit for a period of time, and so on. It is considered a kind of best practice, and that's why I didn't think it's an appropriate thing to allow somebody to just move out of, you know, Bank X straight in. Yeah.
Remember, until our human resource situation changes fundamentally, I understand those as ideals to seek after, but we are extremely sort of limited in Jamaica with technical talent and resources, and I don't think that we should constrain ourselves like that at this point, just for practical reasons.
The damage that can be done to the perception of the institution and its independence and the probity of the appointments and so on, if an appointment that is made that becomes controversial because of the perceived connection, I don't think that's a risk worth taking, even if it's a relatively short period of cooling off period. My own view is that there should be some, but if I don't have the support of others, I won't push the point.
Yeah, I would think we're going to develop our jurisprudence on that over time. So if we can go back to, I think we're at 34FD.
Yes, Chair. This provision speaks to indemnity for the members of the MPC, and this provision proposes Section 34E as the methodology for determining this. We move on, if we may, to Clause 15, which I think Deputy Governor
Which one?
Robertson.
34FE.
34
FE, yes.
FE.
34E was
FE.
added by which of the amendments? Do you remember? So we can just have a look at that indemnity. 34E, the indemnity provision. 2014.
The BSA 10 schedule,
Oh,
2014. 34F, 34FD, 34E. Just a moment. It's in the document, page 208. You are in the 10 schedule, page 208. At the top, right?
thank you.
Okay, so 34FE.
Chairman, members, 34FE addresses the functions of the Monetary Policy Committee, which is the determination of the monetary policy of the bank and related matters. Importantly, it provides at Section 34FE2 that in carrying out the functions under the Act, the MPC shall seek to maintain price stability as defined in the inflation target that is set by the Minister under Section 34FF. Under Section 34FF, which addresses the setting of the inflation targets, provided that the Minister, after consultation with the Governor, shall set the targets. And it speaks to the bank being required to achieve this target on a continuous basis over the medium term, which was defined earlier in the provision as being not less than 36 months. It is provided that the Minister, in setting this target, also shall specify the target measure applicable for inflation and the periods for which the performance will be measured. The proposed section indicates that the inflation target, importantly, shall be expressed as a range for the medium term, and the target shall be reviewed by the Minister. Section 34FF 5, it is provided that in the event that the target is missed, the bank must also must notify the Minister within 60 days, and included in this notification the reasons for the missed actions and the proposed missed target and the proposed actions. And under Section 34FF6, the Minister is required to table a copy of this notification before Parliament. Chairman Member Golding, in his comments, indicated that in the furtherance of democratic transparency and good governance, there should be added a provision requiring that the inflation target, once set by the Minister, be tabled in the House of Representatives within 14 days so that it can be debated. Chairman, we would agree with this proposal, as indeed it is expected that at the time when the Parliament is considering the fiscal policy paper, which sets out the government's economic objectives, which the inflation target is a critical component, the debate on the target would be had in that context. So perhaps for consideration, Chairman, we could add another provision that the inflation target, once set by the Minister, shall be tabled in the House of Representatives. Chairman, Member Golding also...
Yeah, I'm agreeable. That's fine with me. Tabling it, yeah.
Chairman, Member Golding also suggested that in subsection 34FF, given that it is the government's inflation target for which it is accountable to the people, the Minister should cause it to be published on the Ministry's website, Ministry of Finance website, rather than the requirement for it to be published being assigned to the Bank of Jamaica. We also, Mr. Chairman, agree with this suggestion, but in addition, we think that it should not be instead of the Bank of Jamaica publishing, but also in addition to, as the Bank of Jamaica also has an accountability responsibility.
Yeah, Minister, I have no problem with the bank also adding, and one would expect them to on their website specify what the government's inflation target is. But I thought the scheme of it, the mandatory requirement should be on the
I definitely agree with that. And you'll notice that, I agree with that. Yeah. And that has been the practice.
I have one question, which is when they say that the target shall specify the target measure applicable for inflation, what was intended by that language? In subsection 1 of FF.
That would refer to the particular statistics that is used to define the target, specifically the consumer price index and the period over which you're looking at the changes in that particular statistics.
Because it goes on to say the periods at which performance will be measured, which is that the same as the second part of what you just said?
No, it's not. No, it's not. Let me just clarify. I mean, so for example, you've noticed that Bank of Jamaica, we keep talking about inflation was 3.9% at April, and the measure we're using there is the 12 months preceding. So that's the change in the 12 months. That's what we are using. So you want to be sure that that's actually specified, but that's different from the target period over which you're supposed to meet it, okay, which is over the next 36 months, and specifying that you would have to specify that we're going to measure whether you've met it or not in the monthly CPI that's published. So it's specifying what is the measure. It's not left up to us.
Is it quarterly? We're going to measure it quarterly, semi-annually?
Monthly, whatever the
measure monthly would be too much, I think.
Well, no, we measure
but
monthly.
It needs to be specified.
Specify it, right. So the power to specify what it is, we're saying, the minister not just says the target is X, but should specify all these things so that there's no ambiguity about what is the target, how is it to be met, and obviously the bank
by way of example, if the target being set is a range of 4 to 6%, say, the minister in specifying that target would say the inflation target is between 4 and 6% per annum, and the target measure applicable to that is the 12-month CPI, change in the CPI.
Yes.
As measured as at each month.
As published by Statin in its release. So you define.
So that's how it is being done.
One more thing. Yeah. And the period at which performance will be measured would be. There's another piece of information. Would be quarterly, semi-annually, monthly, as the case may be.
Right. Okay. So leaving all of that at large, so to speak, for the minister to specify, he could or she could specify periods of every 2 years, In other words, there are no parameters. He could or she.
I'd hope that when it's tabled in Parliament, whoever is opposition to that minister would take them to task.
Well,
over
they could have
2 years.
already been set. I mean, in other words, really, when it's tabled in Parliament, that's already happened. It's not like it's a proposal which Parliament has any say in. It's reported to Parliament after it has been done. And I think that, given that what is encapsulated in this formulation of words is a series of different important things. First of all, I kind of would have liked them to have been expressed as a list. I think it would have made it clearer, because I've read this and I didn't draw from this language all of this information which is embedded in it, that as to what is in. So I would have liked to have seen an A, a B, and a C as to the components of what is to be specified, and consideration as to periods not exceeding X or something like that. In other words, some outer bands that you must not, in terms of how often it's to be measured, that it shouldn't be some extensive period that would be nugatory, for example. So I just, yeah.
Let me just see if we can just understand what you're saying. So, for example, if you were to list or itemize, you'd list the inflation target that's to be achieved on a continuous basis of the medium term, the target measure applicable.
Right, and that would be, and when we say that, are we just leaving that at large, or should that be clarified as to what target measure we ought to use? In other words, should we not say which shall which shall be the changes in this consumer price index over the last 12 months or something like that? Shouldn't
our sense of that, and the reason I think we think that there needs to be flexibility in this, because just to give you an example, the United States Federal Reserve uses something called their PCE, like a core inflation measure, and they just adopted it because they had that freedom to choose. In the configuration we're discussing here, the minister would have to specify that. Now, so the core measure, which we have a core measure, we have several, and it's possible that there's a shift to that because that makes more sense to people and to the public rather than the headline that we have. These things may well change and should change over time. We felt that it's probably better to have language like this and then specify in a concrete document, which is the target setting. And we appreciate that you don't see that here, so it's raised the point that you've made, I think.
On periods at which a performance will be measured, there we could put a limit. We could say an outer date. Periods at which a performance should be measured, which shall not be greater than.
But even agreed. But even maybe 6 months or what? Yeah. But even on the other one, which is a target measure applicable, surely should be a target measure that is based on something published by Statin. In other words, even if you're not going to say whether it's this one or it's that one or whatever, it can't be something that is like what Mother Teresa from Morant bases. So it must be something that is based on.
I think that's reasonable. Yeah. A target measure for inflation that's captured by the Statistical Institute of Jamaica. It can't be theoretically.
Yeah, true, you Chair. Remember, whatever is captured by the Statistical Institute is historical, but the forecast is futuristic. So we would have to probably look at what is achievable, or whatever the case may be.
No, I mean, I think what Senator Horton is indicating is that Statin. Do they project inflation? No, they measure inflation. So it's a historical. Yeah, and for the purpose of setting the inflation target, it has to.
Measured by someone.
Yeah.
And that was where I think the chair was going. Can we put in language that says, some general language that captures that it shall be measured by the Statistical Institute? Should it be specified, or should it be measured by the agency?
Senator Hall, you'd want a target that Statin has had some history of measuring. So if you wanted to move away from headline to core, for example, and statin never measured core yet, you'd want to signal that and say, hey, statin, start measuring core. And once you start measuring core, we could change the target measure, but you don't want to change it to something that they don't have a history of measuring.
If I could say, Chair,
or you wouldn't want.
I mean, they do measure core, by the way, but I'm just saying.
Well, just to be clear, to say that it is something derived from what statin publish, but the derivation is something nobody is aware of, or the methodology that went into calculating that derivation. It should be something that is established and published.
So that's a good example, because statin doesn't measure core, because core, as you said, is a derived measure from all of their details. So in our future, in Jamaica's future, it may be. There are even people today outside who are saying, Bank of Jamaica, you should be targeting core. It's a legitimate point. It's something worth considering. But then we actually derive core. Nobody else does.
Is there any reason why statin couldn't derive core?
Because it's not a statistic. It's really a manipulation, if you like, of a statistic. And core measures change too. So in this space, there are things that in the future perhaps might not be specified by statin, or that might not be the agency. It might have to be derived from statin, etc. But we're not in that future. We are dealing right now, to be clear to the committee, and I think the government position and the bank absolutely supports that, we're dealing with headline inflation. Statin publishes it. It's a long series, and it is appropriate for us in the near term.
And if it becomes possible to use core as the measure, because it's quite clear what core is, and it is even ratified by, even if it's derived by Bank of Jamaica from the data that statin published, if statin certified that was an acceptable statistical derivation or something, and we wanted to use it, then we could adjust this at that point in time. I don't think that's too
what
difficult.
You want to do, though, is not have a statute. Don't come back to. I would suggest not have it in the statute. So the suggestion of structuring this around some limited periods, establishing that it shall be a measure that is measured not by Bank of Jamaica, by an independent statistical agency, or whatever the right term is. I think getting some language like that would keep the generality, so that we don't have to try and have a parliamentary discussion.
I agree. I'm not suggesting it must be a particular CPI, but I think it should be something that is published by the Statistical Institute of Jamaica.
All right, so if we make those adjustments,
Yeah, I understand from all of this that we're seeking to find some wording to put in regulations, because all of this discussion will find those targets prescribed by the regulation, saying this is how.
What we're proposing is that they would be specified by the minister in setting the target. So that it's not a regulation, but it's a very public document that the bank would have to either accept or complain about.
And if it's left to a minister, it can change from time to time. What I'm saying is that regulations should prescribe the form in which it should be set. For example,
how it is specified and released.
That's correct. So that you, for example, Governor, has to report, or the governor, whoever it is, has to report within 60 days of failing. But along the way, we're not looking at failing after 1 year. We're measuring along the way, which is how we do it now. So that if there is a failing, how do we know that we have failed? Because we might then hear, well, really, we're going to even out by the end of June next year. So how do we deal with the targets along the way, which determine whether or not we're meeting it? Because you may have a couple of months where you're up, another couple of months you're down, and you're saying in the long term we'll even out. So, but I would suspect that in setting.
But once the performance measure is set, though.
Marcus, so I'm saying, how do we set the performance measure along the way? And because that needs to be stated somewhere, so we can determine whether we're succeeding or we're failing.
What this is saying now is that the performance measure must be specified by the minister and must be published on our website, right? And we're going to deliver to Parliament within a short space of time after being specified. Yeah. But if let us say the performance measure is quarterly, say, then if it is not hit on a particular quarter, that triggers the provisions about, which are later on in the section, about BOJ within 60 days advising the minister of that, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the same note, Chair, what if we consecutively miss the target, say about 4, 5, 6 periods? What happens? Do we continue with the target, or do we have something that says maybe we are not competent at that particular target, so we have to review the target, as say after each 4 periods?
I mean, that's a very practical consideration.
But it's dealt with in subsection 3.
It's there.
Subclause 3 on page 17 of the bill.
Oh,
okay.
They didn't hear your question, Senator Horton. You want to repeat it, please? The answer didn't hear it.
Oh, no, I was saying that what if, the mic, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, what if we miss the target, say after 4 or 5 periods, 4, 5, 6 targets, and then we're saying, do we continue with that target, or do we have something that say review the target so that we can get the alignment correct instead of misalignment that we're experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, one could say that the problem with 3, as it's worded, and I don't know if that's intended or not, is that the period of review of the target is to be fixed at the time that the target is set. Now, so you might say, for example, we're going to review the target every 2 years or every 3 years, but that's a long time, you know. And supposing after 9 months or a year, it's quite clear that we need to adjust the target. I don't know if that's infradig in the inflation targeting world that I do not occupy, but you know,
I don't think we should. The fact that we have a review in subsection 3, the inflation target shall be reviewed by the minister such periods as may be determined by him after consultation with the governor at the time of providing the target. So you can't change it after the fact. But I think we want to leave it. We definitely want to leave it open. I mean, inflation is one of those things I have learned. It takes a while, right, for changes to filter through. It takes 18 months.
Yeah, it takes a...
And here we're talking about a 36-month period for the target setting. So you really...
Minimum.
Yeah, minimum. So I think we need the flexibility is necessary, and it's why we want a band. I mean, the JCC in their comments had suggested that, you know, like the UK has moved away from a band and the UK has a point. We're not there yet.
No,
we have to go inside of the band for a long time before we can consider a point.
I mean, one could say that the band has no outer. There's no limit on the width of the band in here. You know, you could have a 10-point band or something, you know, which is kind of crazy. Yeah.
So this is connected.
Why should it be so wide?
We use different monetary policy tools to achieve a particular goal. For example, inflation target, we can use different strategies, including our target interest rate. Now, if, for example, like similar to what is happening now, our target interest rate is coming down, but at the same time, the economy is not responding quickly enough. How do we structure in for example, something like this, that we have to keep monitoring this so that we don't overextend ourselves without the required or the results being manifesting?
Yeah, so this is where the rubber is going to hit the road, right? The governor is going to, or the bank is charged with meeting the targets. They miss the targets, they have to provide an explanation. Parliament will be empowered to call in the bank and their team for them to explain what is happening. And if it appears that there are structural issues on the, you know, on the fiscal side that have to be addressed, then it would be, you know, beholden on a government that wants the target to do that. And if there are changes, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, man. So what if it's not fiscal? What if it's how our commercial banks are responding Now, we know we can't regulate pricing mechanism, but is there something in play? For example, all right, we regulate capital, like market capitalization, and we regulate, for example, the required reserve ratio. We regulate these, but we say we can't regulate how, for example, a bank responds to the central bank policy rate or whatever. Then how does that work? Do we think that we need to really assess this and to say, oh, okay, for example, in order for monetary policy to be effective, then we need a particular fluency in the monetary transmission mechanism. So we put into play that banks must comply with the BOJ, say X, Y, Z, or is that going to be too robust?
So, I mean, the central bank has awesome capacity to influence the way in which over time, the way in which the market develops and the banking market develops. The question that you're asking, though, if I understand you
the fluency
correctly,
of the transmission mechanism. So how can we put in writing then to say, for example, similar to how you have 2% required reserve ratio, you have whatever the capital. So how does the interest rate policy work to say, okay, your bond can be, or your particular spread can be 2. So for example, it's either you bring up the deposit rate or you bring down the lending rate.
You want to go?
Chairman, if I may, I think what the member is pointing to are policy choices that should be left to the policymaker, because there are a number of different options. They may be structural policies, they may be structural in nature, they may be monetary in nature. So you have to be very careful not to draft a law that restricts the ability of the policymaker to consider all the various options.
Chair, can I shed a little light? I think that the transmission question is an important technical question regarding how quickly a policy change by the central bank transmits and to changes in the interest rates that and the credit that is extended and the terms and so forth. So from the perspective of the issue before us here, which is the target setting and the rate change, what this really goes to is how long does it take for a given action to come through. Jamaica's transmission system does transmit the changes, but it takes a longer time. So,
and it's incomplete.
So what happens is that when faced with a transmission system that is not as fluid, to use the language of the Senator, then the actions of the authority have to be, for any given effect we want, they have to be greater. So if we want things to respond faster, we have to respond more sharply with our activities. So if you look at the last 2 years, let's say, Bank of Jamaica has made quite significant changes in its policy that are coming through in expansion of credit and is responsible for an element of the increased activity that we're seeing and the employment, etc., but not as much as we would have liked. But to get that amount of response, if we were in a more efficient system, we, the central bank, would not have moved down rates by as much. We would have moved down by maybe a half of what we've done to get the same effect. So I think just to help the committee in terms of why does this conversation matter and how does it impact things, it really is really saying that we have a tool that we're using, the financial system, and the tool needs improvement. So the impact of that on us is that we have to actually dig more if we want to achieve a certain amount, a certain size of whole or build something. And so it's inherent in the development of the financial system for the central bank to be moving to reform what can be reformed to improve that transmission system. And as my colleague pointed out, some of the measures that clog the system are in fact, for example, fiscal. Some of them are neither fiscal nor monetary, but are structural reforms that are needed. And I think the member may have been hinting at, I'm not sure, Senator, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we have competitive issues to be addressed, okay, in the financial system, and we also have the issue of inclusion to reach a wider number of people.
Senator Horton. Yeah, so the current structure of how we administer this policy, because of its nature, it opens up room for exploitation by these commercial banks. So with exploitation, is a sort of market failure. It's like we can't really. So that brings now, how do we evolve in terms of how we regulate the effectiveness of the policy? You know, so
that's what I interpreted it, Senator Horton to be saying. He's saying, given that the inflation target and the monetary policy that supports it is not having the desired effect at the pace we would like, because there are issues, structural and other issues that are contributing to that inefficiency of the mechanism. Are there any regulatory rules that ought to be considered to push them in the right direction, so to speak, so that the policy could achieve its objective, whether it be some kind of interest rate policy that affects a regulatory rule around the setting of the pricing of credit? I mean, I know, for example, in the microcredit bill, there has been an attempt to limit or restrict lending rates in the microcredit sector.
So they are limiting the margin.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not convinced that's the right way to proceed, but I'm interested in hearing what the response might be from Minister or
Governor. I mean, price controls would be a.
We wouldn't want to go there. Price control.
No,
we're not saying price
no.
control.
But let me say two things, and ask the governor to come in. There is a competition, and the response that you seek, Senator Horton, I would submit is beyond the bill, but the discussion of this clause in the bill, I think, or rather, you raising this point at the time that we're discussing this clause is entirely appropriate, even though the solutions are beyond the scope of the bill. I'd say two things to you. One, the BOJ commissioned a study, a banking study, a competition study of the banking sector, and that has been undertaken by a consultant, and we look forward to getting the results, examining some of the issues, the competition forces, and whether or not those forces are strong enough to, get the kinds of results that we need. Once that study is available, whatever its recommendations are, if the recommendations are considered reasonable, those are options at our disposal. The second thing I'd say is that with the monetary transmission, there are things that the BOJ probably can do, but as we alluded to in a previous discussion, there are things on the fiscal side that definitely contribute. One of them, for example, is the temporary asset tax on financial institutions, which constrains the monetary transmission, interferes with it, because there's a tax for every single asset that the bank acquires, every single new loan. And it means that we don't channel the reductions as fast as we otherwise would. So that is something on the GOJ side, right? So not the bank side.
You could eliminate it for incremental loan growth, for example.
Yeah, well, there are many things you could. You could do it, but when you start, you could do it, for example, take it off of certain kinds of loans, take it off of certain kinds of assets. In my conversation with the bank, you get into problems of measurement and cherry picking and so forth. If we can afford to, and if we...
They want you to take it off fully.
Yeah, but the truth is...
That was a commitment that was given.
And it was a commitment that was given. When it was put in place, it was said it was temporary, and that is how it was, wholesomely accepted. And I think the government, notwithstanding the fact that it's a different administration, there's one permanent government, the government made that commitment, and it needs to honor it at some point. And let me leave it at that. And say that that's an example of something that that's in the government side and not in the bank side, and it would have a significant impact on the transmission.
But could we go back to the point that triggered the discussion, which relates to the bill itself, which is the question of which you raised, which is a review. What happens if the inflation target is being steadily missed over what might be considered a long period of time, and ought to or requires some adjustment because it may not be the right target after all, with the benefit of hindsight and so on. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think we have to probably leave that to natural forces. I don't think that. Certainly at the beginning of this inflation target regime, we will permit ourselves, I hope, some misses and so on. But once this thing is established, there's no minister who, in his or her own self-interest, would want to have a target be missed 6 quarters in a row, right? So the self-interest, I think, would lead to a review, and the bill allows for that review to take place. I don't think we should go beyond that.
Can we just have a look at the wording of 3 and try to understand what is the policy intent behind 3. 3 says inflation target shall be reviewed by the minister at such periods as may be determined by him after consultation with the governor at the time of providing the target. The question for me is, those last words at the end, what is intended by those words, those closing words there?
Chair, if I may comment on that, I think that the intention is to establish clarity and commitment to this target. So it would be undesirable for the target to be changed, and the reason is, you're turning out to be either too high or too low. The target is set to be consistent by the minister, to be consistent with the economic plans established by the government, including fiscal, taking into consideration all of the elements that the government has responsibility for. The target is established. It's important that the target is established to be consistent with those. So that's the first point. So that's what's structured here. Now, the desirable state for an inflation target is that it's actually permanent. So it's just set. When we reach where we would like to go, it might get reviewed from time to time, but the idea is it really doesn't change. You get to a level where it's like that's the normal thing. We're not there. We're operating, because our economy is evolving, I don't think we would want to fix it in that way. But having said that, for inflation targeting to even work at all, given the lags and leads, you don't want to be changing your target with any great frequency. So the idea here, member, is to establish, certainty, clarity about when are you going to review it. Is it every year? Is it every 2 years? What is the period of review of the target? I don't think these should be taken to apply now or to be of concern when we come to the circumstances described where target has been set, fiscal policies are set, debt targets, all those things are going on. Public spending is happening. The economy changes, evolves. A shock has hit. The central bank now has to establish monetary policies that allow the economy to reach that target over the horizon that's been set. And we are missing it, let's say, on some consistent basis, the point made by the senator. The first question is, well, why are you missing the target? Was there something wrong with the economic, something inconsistent in the target setting in the first place? We hope not, because the central bank would have needed to have opined on that publicly once the target was set if it was inconsistent. But let's assume something has changed. Then we say this has changed. An oil price shock, a change in the world. Then the minister would need to review his own fiscal policies, the government's policies rather. We'll have to see what is happening there. And if with all of that, to achieve the target, the central bank would require to do some extreme measures to get to the target, it would have, or any measures, it would have to indicate what those would be publicly, certainly to the minister first. And then those measures, for example, interest rates rising very high or interest rates falling very low, would then have to come into the forecast, the plans for debt, etc., in the fiscal. So you'd be discussing exactly what the outcomes are likely to be in this place, in the annual budget cycle and so forth. And decisions will be made in that context about those measures. Hopefully without the target having to be changed, but a change in the target may be necessary. And so the review would then allow that to happen. So the idea of 3 is to establish a cycle that we are saying let the minister, let the government determine that cycle as well, because that may change from period to period, from 3-year, 4-year cycles may change. Allow that to be at least established so you can discuss it, everybody can know what the cycle is. If you're going to change the cycle, then you're going to have to explain it and discuss it as well, so that the flexibility is built into this as we start. And over time, as the practices gel, as the debates in this place around whatever the government is doing, as the questioning of the central bank as it tries to justify itself happens here, I think we will see a more concrete appreciation of what these things mean, and then make some changes.
I'm just trying to get what this is really trying to say. First of all, subsection 1 says that it is to be achieved the target to be achieved on a continuous basis over the medium term, and that is a defined term as meaning not less than 3 months, 36 months, right? 3 years, yeah. So the target is basically to be set as a minimum as a 3-year target, and is to be achieved on a continuous basis.
Maximum.
Minimum, isn't it? I think it's a minimum.
So you can achieve it before the 3 years?
No, it's to be continuously achieved throughout the 3 years. Throughout the 3 years. Yeah.
So you want a minimum of 3, because let's assume we set a target today that is much lower than where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, without question, the central bank will say, okay, fine, to achieve it, this is what we will have to do, and this is probably, this is how the inflation rate will move over that period, and it may say to a minister and to the public, well, we'll get there in 2 years from now, for example. So the target has been set, but what happens next month? When you get to next month or next quarter, it's not a fixed 36-month period. It's going to continue to be the target for that horizon going forward. Okay? So after you've got half a year into the 3 years, the point is that the central bank still is operating with a view to achieve it over the 3 years that follow. So this will keep rolling forward. 6 months. 6 months from now, the central bank will be operating, and the target is deemed to be applying to the 3 years from that 6 months until it is changed.
Well,
because the target
wording is not very clear
in this first part here.
And I'm trying to understand what the intent is, because if we're saying that it says it's to be achieved on a continuous basis over the medium term, to my mind that means throughout the medium term it must be achieved. So it's not a question of saying, all right, the target is going to be 2% and we're going to get there in 2 years' time. That's not what this contemplates.
And that's not the intent either. The intent is that the target is set today, but it's a target, that's why it's a range. It's a target over the medium term from now until over that 3-year period or 4-year period.
Throughout that period, we're going to be within that range.
We want to be within that range. Yeah. Now, in a scenario where you're here and the target is there and the range is there, then clearly it's going to take some time to get up there, and therefore, if you have reasonable people operating, right, you're unlikely to set a target that for a 36-month period that bears no relationship to where you are today. Right?
But the reason why I made the point, and just if I can clarify,
the difference between 4 to 6 or 3 to 5, or the difference between 4 to 6 or 2 to 5. I mean, it ought, for reasonable people, it is. Let me focus on what you're asked. How you have interpreted it is how it's intended.
Right, but is that the correct intent? Because there's a number of questions. First of all, is it, for example, you could say, can you set a target that you know you're not in currently and won't be in for a while, but it's where you want to get to? Yeah. Or do you have to set, or do you have to set the bottom end? Let's say the target is somewhere above where you are now in this peculiar dispensation, because normally I grew up thinking we want to get low inflation. Now we want to get higher inflation. But anyway, just in the world we're in now, where we want to achieve inflation consistent with a growth rate that is robust to transform the economy. So would it mean we would have to set the lower end of the band, so to speak, where we are now, and say so if we're at 3, we would say we're at 3, and the upper end would be whatever the upper end of that desirable band is, but the band might be wider than
there's no need for the band to be set where you are. I mean, because you remember, that's why it's in consultation with the governor. The governor would probably come and say, look, this is what we see the medium term looking like. If we do nothing, if monetary policy stays the same, then this is the trajectory that we see.
All right, stop there then. So let us say you're not going to set the band with where you are now. All right, so we're now at 3, and the band we're setting between 4 and 6. It would mean then that at the time of setting the target, we are not going to be achieving it on a continuous basis, because we are going to be outside of that target until we get within it.
So this will always be an issue in this sort of framework when there's a change. For example, if you're setting it and it's different from where you are, right? But that's okay, because the point of the target, I mean, even though it's expressed this way, once this is rolling, it's always about the future. And so, and what's more, with the target where we are now, the range of 4 to 6, okay?
We were within it and we've fallen below it.
Yes, and when we take out some of these factors that are essentially temporary, or not temporary, but oil shocks, variables that are external or not subject to monetary policy influence directly, then we don't believe that there's, we believe that this target is actually still consistent with where we should be. Okay, so if we thought, the central bank thought that actually you need a lower target, when you look at this picture, we would be having conversations and suggesting that it should be lower. Okay, but we're not in that position when you look at all of the parameters, the debt reduction, the expansion, and so on. This is, that's one. So having a target that is above where you actually are means that as you start, you will be missing the target and having to explain why are you below as you start, if that were to happen. And in explaining why you're below, you'd be indicating, the central bank would be indicating, well, we're below because this is how long it will take for us to get to the target. Okay, so that process would happen in these transitions. But the conditions we're in today aren't like that. The target was set based on parameters that we believed were appropriate and still believe are appropriate today. That was 2017, a year and a half, nearly 2 years ago. But we've come up much lower. So we are, in our explanations, explaining why it's below, and it is causing us to take action in order to be accountable for this and achieve the objective, to stimulate the economic behavior that will get us up to the target in a year and a half. This is how you want it to work, but there is that gap, I think when there's a change to that.
Sorry, Senator Brown wants to come in.
I get the impression we're not reinventing the wheel. We're already in inflation targeting. We have a 4 to 6% now. We occasionally miss the targets within that 4 to 6 in the medium term, for which we have to report firstly to the minister, and then he has to go report to some people in Washington. That's as it is now. Those Washington people will exit at some point. What is different between this, what we're doing now, and that system of saying? Because I understand it, that while we have a medium-term target, within that medium term, we measure quarterly. And if we miss where we should be along that way, monthly, but we make an assessment.
Performance measures are quarterly. There's a difference.
If we miss that, if we miss whatever we miss, whether it's quarterly or monthly, when we miss that where we should be at that month, that will take us along the way. We have to make a report, which we have done over and over in the last year, at least twice, I believe. What is going to change, and how do we know what target? Will it be in the regulation which says that when we set a 4 to 6 or a 6 to 9, whatever the target is, are there benchmarks along the way in that medium-term period that tells us if we are on target, we are above, below, based on the monthly outturn? How do we know those benchmarks?
For example, Chair, remember the inflation target is a process. So the inflation target is established based on other macroeconomic goals that we want to achieve. For example, economic growth. Now, the trade-off between the inflation target and growth is what we call the sacrifice ratio. So the sacrifice ratio is looking at if, for example, we want inflation to fall, say, from 6 to 4%, then how much growth must we sacrifice? You know, and if we want growth to increase from 2 to 5%, how much inflation must we absorb? So over the short term, therefore, when inflation moves and the growth moves, if we measure them quarterly as an example, then the sacrifice ratio has an important role to play. So based on what he's saying, is it the case that if we have to, in order for us to effectively administer the pricing mechanism, which is inflation target, should we put it down and say we have to have thorough understanding of the sacrifice ratio, or we check it with growth to track the sacrifice ratio to see if the target is moved, like are we getting closer to target or are we moving away from? You understand? Because that is the point. Remember, the inflation target itself is not something like we want to achieve the target, you know. We want the target because we want to achieve certain macroeconomic occurrences.
No,
yes, so it's
it is a target is set to stimulate a certain action. If the target were different, the monetary policy action that the bank has taken wouldn't have occurred, right? If the target were a different rate. So the answer to your question is, I would say, you know,
it still is the point, is the function of the committee.
No, because remember the inflation target is set on the executive side for precisely the reasons that you've mentioned. The calculation of those sacrifice ratios, we believe that at this point needs to be with the executive, with elected people. In other countries, the central bank, they do the sacrifice ratio by themselves. They determine how much growth to sacrifice, how much inflation to, and so on. And we are not yet at a point in Jamaica where we believe that should reside with the central bank. So we're keeping that on the executive side. With respect to what Senator Brown asked, I would say to you that this is modeled on what occurs now, right? The difference being that we are in a fund program, and the measurement dates in the fund program, those are quarterly, right? So it's the quarter that matters in the fund program. Are
we removing those measurement dates?
No. So what we're saying here under subsection 1 is that the minister will be required to specify the periods at which the performance will be measured, meaning the periods at which failure to meet the target would trigger action described in sub.
And we're going to add something to set an outer band.
We're going to set an outer band to say it should not be longer than, and I would say six months. It should not be. It could be 6 months, but it could not be longer than 6 months.
Yeah, I mean it's as I said, it is monthly, will be monthly, but for statutory purposes, you put a wider band of 6 months.
Just to be clear, yes, it might be measured monthly, but the time period or the frequency at which you would be required to testify or to do number 5. If I were, if this were passed today, I would say quarterly, but people can have different, and that's the purpose of the law.
I would have no objection to saying that the review period should not be, the performance measurement period should not be longer than quarterly. I mean, we said 6 months. 6 months is a long time. Maybe in the I don't know if you should think about it, but I think there should be an outer band.
Yeah, I think, and if we're going to put an outer band, put semi-annually. We don't know.
Yeah, but the bigger point for me, not the bigger point, but the point that I was trying to get us to discuss, is really the language that is used in 1, which says that is to be achieved on a continuous basis. Now, the reality is that you may be setting a target which you need to get to that you are not at now.
The thing with that, remember, I think we need to keep that there because we want the bank to act now, meaning, so we're saying to be achieved on a continuous basis. This is a target,
but doesn't that mean that it's the wording of the statute, if it's worded like that, would mean that somebody who sets a target which the country is not now in knows that they are not going to be achieving it until they get within that band, which may take some time because it is a slow train. It's an oil tanker that we're steering, right? It's not a little.
Okay, I mean, if we had the word intended to be achieved, does that? I mean, it's about intention.
Well, that maybe that's what I'm just trying to understand what the intent is, so that the drafter can think about how best to craft that language. But what I don't, you see, once it's worded in a particular way, and you're not achieving it, and the statute says you should be achieving it, then you become subject to criticism.
But the point is that as you don't achieve, you must explain. This is, I mean, I take the point that there's a criticism, but it's the explanation that's critical. And I think, if we indicated here in 5, if you miss it, then you have to explain. Now that explanation is not just I missed it, I'm sorry. It's an economic analysis that offers an.
When does 5 come in? 2 years?
Well, I think that was
or 6 months.
Okay, so
3 months.
And I thought I wanted some clarity on the discussion just prior on review and reporting, because the thinking behind this, the actual practice, is that if you miss at any time, it's a monthly measurement currently. So if it's below, then as it passes, this clock starts ticking. The bank must conduct the review, which is a comprehensive review, and then will provide its explanation, which is a moment when essentially what is done now, like through the fund, every 6 months, or previously every 3 months, you stop and you review.
Every 24 months, 36 months.
Well, this particular review,
when does 5 get triggered?
5 is triggered on a month at which you miss. Okay, any month. Any of the 12 months of the year on which the reported inflation falls below the target.
No, because there must be a correlation between 1 and 5. So one is setting the periods at which performance is measured. It's the periods of performance
as which it's measured.
5 must be related to that what one says. So if the performance is to be measured monthly, then you do it monthly.
This is what I want to explain. Yeah. So what I'm saying is that the practice that we are trying to encode is where if you miss on any month, okay, once the target is missed, then
if it is to be measured monthly,
yes, if it is, and we are saying this practice is monthly measurement, then you must explain. Now there is an arrangement to address. Okay, which requires a protocol where you don't, this type of analysis, you don't actually, you may miss for a month, and based on the analysis that often it's going to take 3 months or 6 months to come back. Okay, so you don't really help the public or anybody to then have a constant reporting of this type. Not reporting, it's analysis, etc., that's fairly repetitive every single month. So you'd want some arrangement there where you've missed and you expect to miss further, that you don't come back every month, maybe every 3 months, to report on whatever it was you said in that first miss.
Yeah, but Governor, just sticking to what the law says here, how you'd address that is in subsection 1, where the periods of performance will be specified as 3 months. Whatever the period of performance is, that will determine when you report, if you miss it.
So
I agree, but
statutory report.
Is the intention to?
I mean, you may report every month that we're off, but the report that triggers the process in 5 would be determined by what the performance measurement period is.
Which is why I come back to say you put that in the regulation, whether it's 3 months or 6 months, but certainly a monthly would be.
But it's a regulation.
It's crazy. So that what I'm suggesting.
Why not put it, if you're going to fix it in
law?
law?
I don't have a problem with it here. But I'm saying that you should.
We want to just say that it should not. It should not be longer than semi-annual. Just leave the flexibility in there.
It has to remain flexible.
It has to remain flexible, Senator Brown.
I'm not against flexibility. Flexibility can be month to month, can be quarter to quarter. Don't tell me to go 6 months out of a 3-year thing. In other words, my members going to be affected by inflation. If it go up, happily if it comes down below. So I have a concern. I want to know. The bank now, as in starting and as is PIOJ, does quarterly briefing. I think that a quarterly.
So you're suggesting it should not be longer than quarterly.
That's
what you want?
I think the issue here, you know.
Cannot allow if
Chairman, you see, if we have a target, for example, a medium-term target, a 4-year target of say 4%, see, and we are at say 2% now. Now, in order to get to that 4%, see, it's a process. So if we look at the 4%, which is the final target, every quarter, which is, for example, every 3 months, obviously it's going to be wrong because it's a process.
And it's a slow-moving ship.
So the point should, based on what we're discussing, shouldn't be to say we are at the 4%, so we missed the 4% target. The point is, at this point,
should there be interim steps?
How close to the 4% should we have been? You understand the point I'm trying to? So there's no way we can say we set an inflation target of 4%, and the next month we expect to be at that 4%. No, let me
clarify. Because but I want to make a comment.
Yeah.
We set a 4%, 4 to 6 for the year. We know each month we're not going to be at the 4 or the 6.
Yeah.
We're going to be on the way there, and we get a sense if inflation went up because the minister cut JUTC subsidy and bus fare go up. So we know that there's going to be a movement, not at 4% 6 months in, but you will get a sense if you're on target. And the current agreement, as I have it, a benchmark along the way to the 4 to 6. That's how I understand the current situation.
Has a wider band.
Right?
Yeah, but I understand what you're saying, but I don't think that the legislation can talk about the path and the projection and how off the projection you are. I think we just have to accept that in periods of transition, especially, not limited to those periods, but in periods of transition when you have change in the target, you're going to have that transitionary period. Right, which I'd expect the minister, when it's been tabled, would speak to.
Yeah. But you see, that may be the reality. I don't like language which does not accord with the reality. That's my problem with the thing we're saying, that it is to be achieved on a continuous basis. Because if we, especially at the outset of a process, where you know that you want to get to a certain range and you are outside it now, to say that it is to be achieved on a continuous basis doesn't accord with the reality of the situation you are in. It ought to provide, for example, that the period within which you intend to get to that target, and if you are deviating from that, achieving it in that period, then you explain why. To my mind, it's just it's fallacious to say that it's to be achieved on a continuous basis if, indeed, you're going to be outside, you may be in circumstances where you're setting a target to get to a place where you aren't presently.
What language you propose?
Could I ask, Chair?
I don't want
think the question
I want the concept to be agreed.
The concept to be addressed, if I understand correctly, Chair, is, this language is not covering changes to the target, basically. So where the change is to something different from where you are, it creates this gap. And so I think you were looking a little earlier as to whether there was a language like which is intended to be achieved, or something that could seek in this language to capture the fact that achievement.
The hard law that you're breaking the law somehow.
Yeah. Right.
Society is made to think that somehow you're breaching the law and this is
if we said intended to be achieved,
kind of thing help with this? I think yes.
Because it's about intention.
From a statutory point of view here, would it allow us that space?
Because Chairman, just to clarify, this inflation target, is set relative to a 12-month period.
No, 36.
Well, hold on, Marcus. 12 months, because we measure inflation annually.
Yeah, but,
So, well,
the target is not set for annually.
starting measures the CPI on an annual basis.
Yeah.
So that when we set inflation over the medium term, we're talking about this 12 months, 3 to 4. Next 12 months, 4 to 6. 4. That's how it's set. Isn't that how it's set now? No. Isn't that how we set the inflation over the medium term now? We set in year 1, 4 to 6. That's not how it's set now?
Let me say, because in the interest of moving ahead, if we are to make the following changes, do I have the support of the committee? 1, on subsection 1, we're going to itemize inflation target, we're going to itemize target measure, we're going to itemize period. 2, we are going to add to target measure a reference to something published by Statin. 3, for periods, we are going to say shall not be longer than.
Shall not be more frequent than.
No,
shall not be
less frequently than. Yeah. I just wanted to get some flexibility, but you're saying your members want to hear quarterly. All right, I will go with you on that. Okay, then quarterly, fine. And then to deal with the point that Member Golding and others have mentioned, the fifth, I've lost count, change would be to say that is intended to be achieved.
Rather than say on a continuous basis, right? If we remove those 3 words from 1 and we inserted a provision that says the target may be expressed in terms that provide for the achieving of it within a specified time, or may be expressed as something that is to be achieved on a continuous basis from the date that it is set. So you have some flexibility as to whether you're saying we're in the range now and we're going to stay in this range, or we're not in the range yet, but we're going to get into the range within a certain. All right.
So if the fifth one was leave out intended, you're saying to be achieved, take out a continuous basis over the medium term. Huh?
Continuous.
Leave out continuous basis.
Leave out continuous basis in the language of 1, but add a provision, add a subsection to say that the target may be specified in terms where it is either to be achieved on a continuous basis from the date that it is set, or is to be achieved within a period specified and to be maintained thereafter.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So you get a little flexibility as to whether you're going to get there and how long you're going to take.
You captured that. That would be number 6. You captured number 6? Number 6 would be that we'd have a...
When you say number 6, what do you mean number 6?
The 5 changes. The fifth one being taken out a continuous basis.
From where it is now.
And the 6th one being adding another subsection.
Yeah. That instead in setting the target, the minister may have specified that it is to be achieved on a continuous basis as from the date that it is set over the medium term, or may set a period within which it is to be achieved and maintained thereafter.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, you're saying that we're going to talk about, currently as I understand it, inflation targets are set over a medium-term basis with an annual designation.
But it's a shifting annual, it's a rolling annual.
It's an annual, we expect?
Rolling annual. So you have January, you have February, you have March.
I accept that, but I know that I will measure at the end of December whether or not you are in the 4 to 6 as you are now, what the target is. So I can get a sense if you are meeting that target. If what you're telling us, you're going to shift that annual assessment to
quarter.
It's not. Currently, we are measuring it every month. Okay.
You measure it every month, but you make an assessment.
Well, if I may say, we are trying to achieve the target every month. Currently, the minister made the point, and I think that it's accepted here that the wording here should sort of express that as not less frequency than quarterly.
I have to explain to people when they sign agreements what all of this means.
Yeah.
I understand it now to be, and if you take out another fiscal paper, you'll see 18 to 19 X. 19 to 20, Y. Or X, maybe the same X.
And those are
so
projections in the FPP.
Yeah,
those are projections in the FPP. Those are not the
rate.
targets. That's not.
Those are projections.
Yeah, and they should be
consistent with a target that has been set.
They should be, but they are projections, and so every year you're correct. Of course, you're correct that it's you have that at December or at March, whatever year you wish. Just to be clear, though, that the assessing and the targeting is not trying to achieve it on those dates. It's trying to achieve it every month now, or if it was specified to be every quarter, it'll be every quarter. That's the point I wanted to
But
clarify.
you're not going to get a flat line running across for every month. You're going to be up and down.
And that's why, as the chairman said, that's why there's a range. The purpose of the range is that we're actually aiming for the middle, but the range is because, exactly as you say, things don't come out exactly that way. So the fluctuations are supposed to be between 4 and 6.
Well, you can be above or you can be below. That's right. So my concern is that we measure inflation every month, and we get a figure. And that figure
is the last 12 months inflation. Every month, that's what you're looking at. What was
so you're going back to the...
Yes.
It's add up every month.
And it must be within the 4 to 6 band. So the inflation over the last 12 months must have been within 4 and 6%. And every month you're measuring that.
So you're saying we're going to measure 5 is going to be triggered, could be triggered every month.
If the performance
is outside
of the performance period in 1 is fixed as monthly, but what you have said, you have persuaded the minister that it should be no greater than quarterly. He was thinking of doing it semi-annually, but
But I am happy for the quarterly.
Outside.
But what I want to be clear, because the way we do it now, you're changing how we do it. This to go back every month, to go back 12 months.
No, we're not. No,
this is what we do now.
See?
No, Senator Brown, that's not changing. How you phrased it a while ago isn't changing.
As I understand it, no. Is that we set, when you sign with the Confederation, we say inflation 4 to 6 for the year. Confed understand that within the year it's going to be, some months may be up, some months may be down. It's not going to be a flat line with saying every month is going to be within the 4 to 6. And then we say, well, at the end of the year, we will be within the target. You're saying,
for that, I think
for the 12
let him finish.
The 12 months that we're going to measure for that year.
Yeah.
You're saying the 12 months is the back, right? So that the annual or the calendar year, if we wish, is no longer the measure of whether or not
no. Let me. I think I know.
The annual
no,
target.
Senator Brown.
Yeah.
Okay. In the agreement that you're referring to, those agreements, we can set whatever measurement date we agree to. We collectively, together, mutually agree to. So
Minister, if you're talking about salaries, wages, and you have a period, an agreement period, and you are committing to inflation over that period not being outside of a certain band, because there's a nominal figure, which is salaries, is set for that period, and you don't want the purchasing power of that to be depreciated by inflation outside of that band. So the inflation that is relevant for the purpose of that agreement is the inflation over the period of the agreement. That's one issue. What we are talking about now is slightly different. What we're saying is we've set an inflation target. The Bank of Jamaica measures it monthly. The minister can set what the performance review period is, and we're going to put an outer band in the law that he can't set it for annually. It must be reviewed at least, and you said quarterly. He had initially said semi-annually would be the outside in terms of how often you review it. Whatever that period is, at that period you say what was the last 12 months CPI to that point? Was it within the band or not? If it was outside, it triggers BOJ doing an analysis and reporting and explaining what's going to be done to fix it, etc. So every review period, whether it be monthly or whether it be quarterly, depending on what the minister decides, as long as the review period is not more lengthy in terms of how often it occurs than the law allows, which we have to put in there, every year you're looking over what was the inflation over the 12 months leading to that test date, and was it within the band that's been set by the minister as a target, essentially.
So again, you're looking back. You're looking retroactively.
We always.
No, we don't always.
No, because in your agreement, when you're saying inflation for year one of the wage settlement should be no more than 4 to 6%, it's going to be at the end of the 12 months that you're going to say what was the inflation over that first year.
Are we able to look forward and measure it at that point? So we're making a change in how we do these things.
Why say we look forward?
Because when I sign in April, I'm looking to next year March to measure it. So I'm looking forward.
Yeah, but
you won't know if it's achieved until next year March.
That is correct.
And when you look at next year March to see whether it's achieved, you're looking at what happened over the year up to next year March. So you're always measuring it by reference to what has happened over that period.
Of course, I hear you on that. My concern is how the people out there look at the inflation month by month as we go along and see where it has gone. This approach we're adopting says we will measure the X range month by month looking back. Two different approach that is being dealt with.
What would be an alternative approach in your mind, other than to say when you're measuring whether or not you're within the inflation target, you're looking at what inflation has actually been to see whether or not you're within the target? What other way of approaching it is there?
When March comes next year, we will look back. But there has to be, because it's not an adjustment just as you go back. It has to be also what happens as you go forward, because that is what is going to determine.
But I think the point is that when you have missed the target at the review period, let's say it's a monthly review period, which is what they actually say they do. So, bam, come the end of May, we are not in 4 to 6. We are still in 3.4 or whatever, 3.5 or whatever it is. Then you make a decision what action is to be taken to get you within 4 to 6. So that is what,
we are one on that part.
That is what the purpose of the review is. Now,
that is looking forward.
The transmission
and that is looking forward, yeah?
For monetary policy. That is forward. That action is how we're going to, having taken that action, things should happen in the economy to generate more inflation, to bring you within the target.
And that forward-looking part, Senator, would be one, a forecast at that time by the bank as to what we forecast with everything we know will happen in the future to inflation. We have to say, in fact, we just published on Monday, we just published our exact forecast going forward to say this is what we think will happen. So we'll be doing that.
You're not measured by the forecast, you're measured by the...
Well, we have to convey this is what we are saying, what we think will happen, and then we have the target that would have been set by the minister for what it is supposed to happen, what he wants to happen, what the government has, what you've said you need. And then we have to account for, in the forward-looking part, we have to indicate what actions are we going to take that will cause the inflation to come back in the range. Right now, we often are talking about inflation being below, but I think the part that concerns, I would say, most Jamaicans is going to be when inflation is above the target, what are you doing to bring it back down to make sure that the cost of living is not undermined? So that's the reporting process that we talk about. It's a report, but it's a forward-looking analysis that tells everybody what we expect to happen and what we're going to do about it from a monetary perspective, and then people can plan for that.
So, going back now to the original point that triggered all of this, which is how the review of the target works. All right. Now that I want to understand what we mean by review. So I had this conception in my mind, which may be wrong, that it is set in September 2017. It is set at 4 to 6, and it's over the medium term, so it's a 3-year period. At the end of which, you would set another target for the then medium term. So you'd have a 3-yearly cycle of setting. Within that now, there may be a need to adjust the target, review the target within that. Now, 3 I thought was saying that the minister sets the period for those reviews within the medium-term period. And he sets that having consulted with the minister at the beginning of the period. Now, given what the overall intent is that having set the target for the medium term, we stick to it. I don't know why we're reviewing it. There's a methodology for periodic review of it. I thought that you would only review it if there have been circumstances, exogenous shocks being an example, which necessitate a recalibration of the target, because you're no longer in the world you were in when you set it. It's a different world now, and we need to adjust it accordingly. So that the resetting of the target within the medium-term framework ought to be only where the bank advises the minister that the conditions have substantially or materially changed to the extent that warrants the target being reconsidered, and then he would then reconsider the target based on that. So rather than having a review period that is at the beginning of setting the target, you enshrine this review period as if you're not committed to the target for the medium term. Rather, you set the target for the medium term, and you only adjust that target if circumstances which were not foreseen have transpired. Let's hope they never do, but maybe they're positive ones. Maybe all of a sudden, all this oil that they're talking about, we suddenly get it. And somebody's prepared to buy the next 50 years of our oil sales up front for cash, and we pay off all our national debt.
Preach it.
Yes.
Prophesy.
So no longer, all of a sudden we have no debt. And all of a sudden we don't want, the inflation target. I mean, that's obviously, but I'm just saying it could be a positive or a negative. Unfortunately, the way of life is, it's usually a negative, right?
Let me say,
I'm seeing it wrong. That's
you're not under usual circumstances. That's one thing from the politician side or from the representative side, and you can come in. I mean, a situation where the target is being changed frequently, or it's set November 17 and by 2018 you change it, and there's no apparent exogenous or endogenous shock that has led to it, is not a scenario that we want. Yeah. And the way it is worded here, that scenario we don't want is permitted. It's built, yeah. It would allow that to happen. The question is, if we try to tighten it, can we accommodate what we lose by tightening it?
Well, I think the wrinkle I wanted to mention needs to be considered. This setting of the target over the medium term was not intended to represent a fixed period of time of 3 years, meaning that it's got to be rolling, and so the language we have to be sure that we're capturing that. So, for example, to give you an example of why this is important, we're 2.5 years into this 3-year period in the way you were thinking about it or presented it.
So if it's rolling, what is the relevance of 3 years?
So let's assume that it is fixed as 3 and it's not rolling. We get to 2.5 years in, and now you've only got 6 months more of a target. Since the central bank is operating with a minimum lag of 1 year to 18 months, okay, then the question would then be, well, what are you now aiming at? So when the target is set, the point is here that it's a medium term, which is at least 36 months, because the minister may specify a longer period, but 36 months works for us. But once it's set, it's not that it then will be changed after 3 years. It will continue to be the target until it is changed.
So if it is, I'm trying to understand what's the relevance of 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. If it is something which, on an ongoing basis until changed, is to be pursued and hopefully achieved, what is the relevance of this 3-year target in that? Because it's not something that is reviewed every 3 years. You're saying that's not what's intended. It's not like set for 3 years and then reviewed at that period. That's not what it is. It is something which is set and is to apply until changed. And so what is the relevance of 3 years in that construct?
So there's a need to capture the fact that any time you set that target, and in a way it's a little like your point earlier that was being addressed by splitting up the continuous basis, so that when a target is set that's different, you've got a period of time in which it's not going to be there. It's still the target, but you're not going to meet it. So it was to establish that target setting can't be for periods shorter than the medium term. Any decision-making, the political policy decision-making of whatever the target should be, has to be a medium-term
I think, no,
period.
here is where the kind of economics and legal interpretation are kind of beginning to clash, right? Because at the end of the day, this is legislation. And what it actually says is that the inflation target shall be expressed as a range for a specified medium-term period. Okay? So that, and that is how, in practice, I would interpret it and want to see it. That we set a target and we say this is a target over the medium term. For medium term here, we're thinking about 3 or 4 years. And it's not that the target, it just goes on. It is that I would expect that there would be an affirmation that the target remains 4 to 6. You wouldn't just be silent on it.
Which is why you need that review period, because essentially after you've gone even a year into a 3-year period, you're starting to reach the boundaries of monetary policy forward-looking. We are starting to, we're dealing with some stuff in year 3, which is a year ahead, but we're starting to think about year 4. Not starting to, we're actually considering effects in that period. So I think that clash, or the reason for 3 is then to establish that process of review, whether it's in a year or in 2 years.
Sorry, I really want to understand exactly what they intend. So when you say it is set for 3 years, are you saying that, what are you saying? Are you saying that the target is to be achieved by the end of 3 years? Clearly not. That's not what you're saying. Are you saying that the target is to last 3 years? No, that's not what you're saying either. So what are you saying about the 3 years? Yeah.
No, so we are saying, let's assume that we're not dealing with the transition issue that you mentioned earlier. So we are now at, assume that we are at 5% and the target is 4 to 6. So what we're saying is that we have to manage policy such that over the target period, which currently from now is 3 years, we are to set policy to achieve that, and we have to account for all of those periods between now and 3 years. Okay,
you're in the range now.
Yes.
You are to manage monetary policy, yes, so that the target is achieved for 3 years.
During all of the 3 years in front of us.
During all of the 3 years.
At a minimum, yeah. Now we know that the near term, whatever is happening next month and next quarter, has been set from before. So there's a little wrinkle there.
So the 3 years really applies to not how the target is set, but how Bank of Jamaica responds to the target. And in other words, Bank of Jamaica really, having embraced the target or been set the target, performs its functions to achieve it throughout the ensuing 3 years. Whatever point in time it is during that period, it is always looking towards the next, ensuring that the next 3 years out, yes, it is achieving the target for that period.
For each of the performance times in that period,
within
exactly,
that period,
as defined. So that's the idea. So as we finish 3 months, okay, we are still looking forward over the same period of time. So that's the reason for that concept.
Yeah, So yeah, I mean, you're good. So just in the interest of, again, sort of making progress with those 6 changes, I have to keep focus on the goal. Let me go. Shall I read them again? Or
before you do, and I know we're anxious to make progress, and I think we are making progress, because I think we're digging out what is really sought to be achieved by these words. And essentially what we're saying is that the Bank of Jamaica, in responding to the inflation target, seeks to ensure that for all of the performance review periods over the ensuing 3 years, at all times during that 3-year period, it is that Jamaica will achieve that target. Yes. That's essentially, so it's really Bank of Jamaica who is operating on a 3-year cycle in terms of how it responds to the target, rather than the target being set on a 3-year basis, or in the 3 years doesn't really relate to how the target is set. It relates to how Bank of Jamaica responds to the target, in how it orders its affairs monetary policy matters are conducted.
Because the length of time it takes for their actions have effect. They always have to be looking out.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the target is set, and the question is, when the target is set, what should be the things? What should be the basis of any review of the target?
So I think that's the reason for now 3, which says, okay, well, you should indicate as you start, a minister, government, we're going to review this on this cycle or whenever we're going to review it. I think we should put it that way because where we're heading with inflation targeting, when you get to a fully settled, developed state, is where actually the inflation target settles down to a sort of set number that pretty much everybody is aiming at, and it stays there. It can be changed, but it doesn't get changed because it's an anchor. It's what actually anchors all the other policy setting. But of course, it has to be under the control of somebody, which would be the minister, in case you do need to change it, oil shock or whatever it is. And
or a financial system stability
absolutely,
crisis, which in 2008, and the response to it.
Yeah. Those would be examples of circumstances. And we really don't know what could come. And since we're starting here, so the language, you want it to be sufficiently clear, but allow for that flexibility but it would be under the control of the minister and presentation.
But given the intent of this target setting regime, what is the purpose of the review? Is the review to allow a rethink as to whether the target is correct, or is the review or is it that we want some sort of purposiveness or finality or consistency in the way the target is applied and so on? You don't want the target to be bouncing around.
No, we don't. But I think I can answer that. That remember that in a sense there's always the coordination problem. I think that Senator Horton touched on that in the sense of that sacrifice ratio. These are critical questions that a government must decide. So, and there will be changes. I mean, we believe that 5%, for example, as a midpoint of this target is appropriate for Jamaica, but we hope that Jamaica will be in a future that's not too far away, that Jamaica will want to have a lower inflation rate. We believe that. When does that happen? What are the sacrifice ratios? Those are the questions. So that's what we anticipate, and so hence this structure. It's that kind of a change, and it ought to be progressive, so it's all consistent with what's happening. But governments may need to make changes based on some of the things you mentioned, shocks and so on.
If this law was coming into effect June 1, and we were setting an inflation target on June 1, what would be the periods that you would recommend that under subsection 3 that it be reviewed?
I haven't had that conversation with the minister yet. In terms of I'm not dodging your question. I'm not dodging the question.
Yeah.
I mean, we do recognize that the development of the policy planning process in terms of the fiscal policy paper, it's very important that these targets and actions are made to be consistent. Otherwise, there are major problems. So, we do operate understanding what the country understands, what is the fiscal objective and so forth. And, speaking frankly or pragmatically from where we are now, the 5% is in there, everything is operating on that basis.
Has been for 19 or 20 months, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's been no review of it since we set it back in 27 September.
Not a full-scale review, but I can indicate that when we report on the target being low, and we have been low for quite a bit now for various reasons, we've indicated to the minister a view that we should still keep the target where it was, and the minister...
We've been outside the target for more of the time that the target has been applicable than we've been within the target.
Is that so?
I reckon. Because inflation came very sharply down at the beginning of 2018.
Yeah, we've had some significant help in that sense, but it's made us a little bit uncomfortable. But we like low inflation, remember, so it's a difficult situation to be in. Having said that, the minister has had the opportunity and has said so in the last publication, has indicated that he has kept the rate unchanged. This is the informal structure we're operating with now, not being regularized. So when you ask what would happen now, I believe that as we start now, but it's subject to the minister and the government, we would be establishing a 5%. We would be operating with a minimum 3-year horizon, probably 3. We would establish a review period that may, it's subject to the minister, maybe that you would review it at the next FPP, perhaps in the initial case, or it might be that a review is every 2 years. I think these are some questions. It was something like that to allow for, there's this questioning that has occurred as we were below the target by many people to say, why is the target this? How come it's this level? Couldn't it be lower? I think that these are important questions that governments, ministers have to be able to answer in a very public and deliberate way. So the bank's duty would be to develop the analysis, establish the framework that demonstrates the sacrifice ratios and the issues like that for consideration, and then a minister would decide.
Chairman, it's clearly unclear. And while the Canadian model is different in that the minister doesn't get involved, I'd love to see how they review, how they carry out their review, if they carry out a review. Because our model will be different from them in as much as the Bank of Canada set the target. But I'd love to see how they carry out their review. I'd love to hear how they carry out their review, how they look at it. So, because we're going into, it appeared to me, new territory, different from the arrangement we have up until now with the IMF, so let me finish. So I see it. So I'd love to get from the technical people a sense of how that review takes place. But I think you ought also suggest that Dr. Robinson come in after you had spoken, and I'm waiting to hear his views, if he has one that he was putting forward.
Yeah, go ahead, Deputy Governor.
Sorry, I was just going to read something. Many countries, this is from Google, I just Googled who sets the inflation target. Many countries have an inflation target, often set by the government for a central bank to achieve. E.g., the UK government sets the Bank of England an inflation target of 2%. Their aim is to keep the annual rate of consumer prices inflation, CPI, within the annual rate within 1% of the target. Because it is an annual rate. No,
it's every month, though. They review it every month.
Keep it within 1% of the target. Yeah.
Yeah, so we can have the bank look at precedents for review. I think it's clear that you need to have a provision for review. We definitely don't want a scenario where
for Canada, because Senator Brown mentioned Canada. All right. At the heart of Canada's monetary policy framework is the inflation control target. That's what they call it, which is 2%, the midpoint of a 1 to 3% target range. So they have a target which is the midpoint of a 1 to 3, which is 2%. First introduced in 1991, the target is set jointly, Canada, set jointly by the Bank of Canada and the federal government and reviewed every 5 years. Yeah, that's how they do their thing.
So they put a specific time period.
We can share with the committee a list of countries and what they do.
And what different people do.
Yeah.
Okay.
We could have a little table here which I could get circulated if you would.
Fair enough.
So you can. Yeah.
Okay, so the next time we would start at 34 FG, unless we think it's simple enough for us to deal with here. It would be great if the next time we were at Financial Policy Committee.
I must say I still don't feel comfortable in the context of what we're doing, that the way that subsection 3 is what is intended. So because if we want to have some kind of policy consistency, I would have thought that the policy is that it should be set and maybe reviewed every 3 years unless circumstances during that period have changed so fundamentally that the bank recommends to the minister that he reconsider the target. So as to
let us consider that. Let's consider. Let's consider that. Yeah, let's consider that. I mean, I don't think it's an unreasonable suggestion, but I would like to consider and consult technically. Do I have the committees to attempt 34FG, or you? Yeah, just attempt it. If it looks as if we're going to get bogged down. By the way, Governor, I think we're going to have to change a previous section that prohibits members of the Senate and the House of Representatives from serving on the Monetary Policy Committee, because as far as I can determine, I think we had a Monetary Policy Committee meeting just now.
The expertise that's building.
It hasn't been good. I'm just going to attempt. 34FG is about the publication. And one is the committee shall publish statements of the performance of the bank with respect to its monetary policy, its achievements in relation to the inflation target, and shall also issue monetary policy updates. The statements referred to in subsection 1 shall be prepared at the end of every 6 months or such other period not exceeding 6 months as may be determined by the committee or as may be directed by the House of Representatives, and shall be submitted by the chairman of the committee to the minister, who shall promptly cause a copy of the statements to be tabled in the House of Representatives, and the chairman of the committee shall be available to present the statements to the House of Representatives and to answer questions in relation thereto as may be required. The committee shall, at the end of each meeting, meaning Monetary Policy Committee meeting, or as soon as practical thereafter, cause to be published on the bank's website a summary of decisions made at its meeting and the reasons therefore, and shall further, within 6 weeks of the conclusion of said meeting, cause to be published on the bank's websites the minutes of the meeting. The committee shall provide regular reports to the board on its operations at such frequency as the board may require. So,
Sure.
I just think 6 weeks is a very long time to publish the minutes.
I think 6 weeks. Yeah, somebody had mentioned that in the submissions as well. Governor, what's your?
We thought that we'd address that by having the decision details published immediately, so that the summary that you'd mentioned. That's our response. Minutes, however, you produce minutes, then you need the members to agree, and so on and so forth. The 6 weeks is, I think, consistent with what the expert, the central banks have been doing this for a long time. They're using 6 weeks as well. So, yeah, it's not a long time for minutes to come out. No. Yes, please do. But also there is it's also helpful. I mean, that practice has been evolving. I think I noticed that the Fed recently brought forward their release, for example. After many years of, I think, 6 or 8 weeks lag, they brought it forward. So these things can evolve over time, but the 6 weeks is a minimum that at least provides to be certain that what is being put together is appropriate, that the members agree, and so forth. There's another factor too, that sometimes there may be things discussed in the meeting that are not necessarily, they're sort of they have a market impact that needs to come out a little bit later, but you'd still want them in the minutes. So it's not a long period from that perspective.
A full set of minutes of each FOMC meeting, which is the open market, the Fed committee, is published 3 weeks after the conclusion of each regular meeting. And complete transcripts of meetings are published 5 years after the meeting. That's complete. That's, I suppose, word for word transcripts of it.
And they, if I may say, they just got to that in, I don't know, the last couple of years or so. I mean, and you want to establish that and make sure that this information is correctly put. You can't revise it afterwards, so forth. I think it's useful to allow a little time.
We have minutes prepared for committee meetings by the staff here. And they produce detailed minutes, typically, and they produce them within a week. Certainly for the PAC, they have been producing them for every week.
Let me ask you, the minutes have to be confirmed.
Yes.
But given that the Monetary Policy Committee is only meeting 8 times, they're not meeting monthly. That is so the meeting, you'd have a meeting.
All right.
It can only be confirmed at the next meeting.
Okay, this is the Bank of England now. Initially, the minutes were published about 5 weeks after the meeting. Since October 1998, the Monetary Policy Committee has published the minutes of its monthly meetings on the Wednesday of the second week after the meetings take place, i.e., they are published at 9:30 a.m. on the Wednesday, 13 days after the Monetary Policy Committee decisions.
So I would take this as something that the committee would urge that we seek to meet that standard, but I think we should not start by imposing it. But I would make another point, Minister, that...
Well, let me just to take on the committee's suggestion in my job as chair. I mean, what's the magic of 6 weeks? Why not 5?
Well, I wouldn't be quibbling over those. The 6 weeks was chosen because that appeared to be a norm. I think 6 to 8 weeks was what we had been seeing. And as I said, central banks have been trying to do better, but that's why. It's also about 4? Our experience of preparing minutes for boards, etc. You made the point, Minister, Chairman, about
is there going to be undue suffering if it were 4 and not 6, or 5 and not 6?
No, but there's also the point that these are not minutes like, for example, this body. It's not a record of every single thing that was said. These are meant to capture in an appropriate way, obviously minutes of a meeting, but also in a way that is relevant for the market. So these are, to some degree, technical minutes as well.
4 weeks is 28 days. I mean,
Chairman, can I suggest that...
It has a secretary that's assigned to it.
They approve them by round robin.
Can I suggest, Chairman, that they look to see how
Why do they have to meet to have a meeting?
Senator Brown, sorry.
That they go back and look, because we're not going to decide it.
The question would be what period.
Go back and look to see how soon you could fulfill, because the committee desire to report to Parliament that we want an earlier period, and for you to go back and look and tell us next time we meet whether or not it could be earlier than the time that you have proposed now.
I think we can take a look, as the chair suggests, but may I draw attention, though, if I may, to subsection 3. We put this there for this precise reason, which was the issue...
Before it goes to 3, I want to raise a
But I'm responding to your point about minutes, though, if I may. Subsection 3, with respect to the minutes, the point, we put this here because we realized we wanted to put out immediately the relevant information for the public so that there's no delay. So it's not 6 weeks for this. It's the same day or as soon as practical thereafter. I want to emphasize that summary of the meeting, to many people would be like minutes.
I really like that. I just think, we're setting a standard here, and 6 weeks to approve a set of minutes and get them published is an unduly lenient standard. That's all I'm saying. I can understand why the institution has to comply with it once a long period, but from my purposes as a lawmaker, I think we should try and do it a little bit more exacting than that. But
so let's take up Senator Brown's suggestion of bringing some precedents.
We'll take a look. We'll give you the precedents as well, which we have as well for all those countries, and we can look at that.
Senator Brown, you had another point.
Yeah, at 34 FG2. Just a matter for the technical people to look at. The statement referred to in subsection 1 shall be prepared at the end of every 6 months or such other period not exceeding 6 months. So, it could be less, but just make the language a little more elegant so that it's clearly where we're going, rather than the repetition of the 6 months. It doesn't really...
I think the intention is to say that they could actually do this every quarterly if they wished, or something more frequent.
By the committee or the House. Let's drop the language that take it in that direction.
Or any other period less than 6 months.
No, it's
every period not exceeding 6 months. I mean, you could.
Every period not exceeding 6 months.
I think that's what this is trying to say. So, remove the brackets and the comma, basically. Is that?
There's some redundancy. Yeah. There's some redundancy.
There's another little drafting point.
I know. I saw you on 1.
Before 1, can I just understand this one, just to be clear, Senator Brown's point? I think, does it get to that language if, as it says, or such other period not exceeding 6 months? So remove the brackets and we're there.
I think removing of the brackets meets his point. He doesn't want to have the 6 months repeated into it.
Like that.
You see how those things come in. You first had 6 months, and then somebody said, "Hey, it could be long." This is the purpose of this.
Or such other more frequent period, or something like that. Yeah.
And I think, thank you, Senator Brown. That's a good catch.
We can ask the drafters.
Senator Golding, in his written comments, had a drafting suggestion to insert the word "and."
Yes, after between monetary. Yeah. Replace the comma with and, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In fact, the comma should probably come after target in the fourth line. So it's with respect to its monetary policy and its achievement in relation to inflation target, comma, and shall also issue monetary policy up.
Yeah. Okay. Subject to looking at the precedents as Senator Brown suggested and reconsidering. Subject to looking at the precedents as Senator Brown suggested and reconsidering the 6 weeks. Can I take it that we have through on 34 FG with those provisos, and we probably stop here for today, which sort of brings us to any other business. I don't know if there's any other business, and if not, date of next meeting. We had set 3 consecutive Wednesdays, which we have exhausted, but we still have a third of the bill to finish. The House gets busy in June with other committees during the Wednesdays. There's an opening next week Wednesday. No, not yet. No. There is an opening next Wednesday at 2 o'clock. I'd conferred with Senator Gale before he left, and that was okay with him. I believe the governor is away, but your team can carry the ball.
They're more than equipped, Chair.
In fact, so if we could have the next meeting.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate the comment. Don't get much love where I'm sitting, but I'm.
Next Wednesday at 2 p.m. And I want to just try and grab the dates while I can. There's an opening on Thursday, June 13th. The Wednesdays in June are all gone. We're at 2/3 of the way. I'm hoping that if we have 2 more meetings, we should be able to.
Could we do it in the morning rather than the afternoon on Thursday?
I'm open, yeah. And yes. I have the same. So if you said Thursday at 10 o'clock, so the next 2 meetings, that June 13th, Thursday, June 13th. Oh, what time is that? Oh. Okay, let's look at the calendar again. No, I'm traveling on the 6th. You have a calendar on you? Yeah. The Wednesday is gone. They have 2 joint select committee meetings on a Wednesday. Yeah, there's one, sorry, on the 12th, there's one it says 10 to 12, and then HRSDC at 2. I mean, suppose we started later in the afternoon on the Thursday. My challenge is if we miss the 13th, we're in July. Let's try 13th at 2. Thank you for accommodating. So we have 2 meetings, next week Wednesday at 2 o'clock, and then Thursday the 13th of June at 2 o'clock. And hopefully in the governor's absence we'll make even more progress.
See why I need your love, Senator Brown.
All right, thank you. We have a motion to adjourn. Seconded. All in favor? Thank you all very much. Thank you.